Welcome, everyone. I'm actually 30 seconds early, so thanks for being early with us this afternoon in Weil Hall in our very special space of Keynote Court. It's nice to start in this space to think about this is a place that was designed for interdisciplinary intersections between art, architecture, design, and also other disciplines across the university. We often find students from all over campus enjoying this beautiful space. Super excited today to have you all present and about our program in particular, AI plus design, or AI and design, could be design plus AI. We can determine that as the day goes on. I'm Colangelo, Dean of the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts and the Ralph J. Nagel Dean, and I'm happy to present this special mini-symposium on AI, inspired by our keynote speaker, Krishna Bharat. The event is also co-sponsored by the Sam Fox School and McKelvey School of Engineering, and I'm also joined by my good colleague, the McKelvey School of Engineering Dean, Bobick, who has been a strong advocate for our collaboration and a leader in action recognition by computer vision, a field in which he's a pioneer. Recently, he has also extended his research to robotic perception for human-robot collaborations, and there's a whole lot more because we're not going to go into a long introduction of Ahrens just now, but you're going to hear from him in the concluding remarks. So we're very happy to have Bobick here in the front today with us. About a year ago now, Krishna and I met in Palo Alto. At that meeting, Krishna discussed advances in AI, in particular the rapid advances in text-to-image-based programs, and his perspective on the potential intersections between design and AI, as he described as a fascinating space ripe for innovation and disruption. His insights and speculations truly had my head spinning, maybe even hurting a little that day. His ideas excited me and challenged me to think more deeply about the potential of AI relative to our fields of art, architecture, and design, as well as what this potential would mean for the future of our school. It's great to see so many students here today, as well as faculty and staff. Thanks for coming. Krishna and I kept our conversation going over the ensuing months, considering the role of AI in art and design education, and anticipating what the next generation of practitioners will need. The school's newly completed strategic plan informed these conversations as it inspires to harness the power of transformative digital tools in architecture, art, and design, and the museum, which he also saw as a critical part of our formation as a school, staying at and pushing on the cutting edges of our field. Krishna asked me how he could help give the school a head start on these crucial inquiries. And today, thanks to the enormous generosity and leadership of Krishna Bharat and his wife, Kavita, I'm very pleased to announce the creation of the Kavita and Krishna Bharat Professorship intended to do just that. The Bharat Professorship will be used to recruit a leading and accomplished faculty member specializing in artificial intelligence and emerging technologies, who is also deeply invested in advancing the fields of architecture, art, and design. The Kavita and Krishna Bharat Professor will also hold a joint appointment in the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts and in the McKelvey School of Engineering with the support of the McKelvey Challenge Grant, another gift intended to promote interdisciplinary initiatives across engineering in the Sam Fox School. Now I would like you to recognize Kavita and Krishna. Thank you very much. It's very exciting to make this announcement here today. You were here, so thanks for being present. With the professorship and these goals in mind, we're here today to explore the intersection of artificial intelligence and design, two fields that are rapidly evolving and becoming deeply intertwined. From self-driving cars to chatbots to generative art, AI is rapidly transforming the way we live, work, and create. Design, on the other hand, is the process in envisioning, planning, creating, and producing human-centered solutions to complex problems, whether they are physical, digital, or social. Together, AI and design have the potential to enhance human creativity and address some of the most pressing challenges of our time. At the same time, they also raise important questions of ethics, bias, transparency, and agency. Today's symposium is intended to advance our strategic initiatives and get past the hype and sensationalism and grapple with AI's real capabilities, as well as examining the sorts of tools, skills, and interfaces that will allow designers across disciplines to harness its best potentials. We'll begin the task of reckoning with the sea change in AI that will bring architecture, art, and design practice, and we'll begin the task of reckoning with the sea change that AI will bring to architecture, art, and design practice and education. My hope is to start a series of conversations to include students, faculty, and the public focused on the topic of AI plus design and creativity more broadly, with the focus on some work being done here at Washington University, as well as the potential to take leadership in this role, leadership role in this important area. We'll also consider the future of our curriculum and programs as we respond to the emergence and inevitable integration of AI and machine learning. To explore these questions and more, we have gathered a distinguished group of who engaged in various aspects of AI and design, and I'm certain this will foster a rich and diverse conversation that reflects the complexity and diversity of AI and design. We'll have a discussion between Kory Bieg, principal at OTA and program director of architecture at the University of Texas at Austin, and Ian Bogost, the Barbara and David Thomas Distinguished Professor, Director of Film and Media Studies, and Professor of Computer Science and Engineering here at Washington University. The two, as it turns out, just by chance, as we were looking up who is doing innovative work in this area, Kory, one of our alumni, it just turns out that Ian and Kory are childhood friends. So this should be an interesting conversation since they grew up with this stuff, so to speak. Or not. It sort of evolved as they were growing up, at least. After that, we'll have a panel discussion entitled The Machinic, Muse, AI and Creativity, hosted by Constance Vale, who turns out is still on her way back from Portugal and will be here at some point, but probably not during her presentation. And Matthew Allen, who was coming from Toronto, also got delayed, so now we have regrouped and we have a new plan. The panel now will be led by Sharvari Mahtre, who's here as a lecturer at Washington University, and Chandler Ahrens as well. So we look forward to that presentation. Hopefully Constance will be here sometime before we conclude today and participate in the last part of the event. Our final panel, Human-AI Interaction, Designing the Interface Between Humanities and Artificial Intelligence, is hosted by Jonathan Hanahan, Associate Professor in Interaction Design. This panel will focus on crafting the intersection of design, and more specifically, design and with emerging technology. So look forward to all of their talks today that will unfold during the afternoon. For the sake of time, we're going to have the bios. We have the bios printed, and we also have a QR code so that you can look at all our guest speakers in more detail. But first, it's my great honor to introduce Krishna Bharat. Krishna is a technologist and innovator working at the intersection of computing and online search. He is a distinguished research scientist at Google and founder of Google News. Launched in 2002, and with more than 72 international editions, Google News provides access to a diverse set of news tools, driving billions of visits to news sites every month. Krishna joined Google in 1999 to start Google Research. He helped define the group's charter and recruit the first batch of research scientists. He's also founded Google's engineering operations in India in 2004 and served as the first director of Bangalore R&D Center. Prior to joining Google, Krishna was a research scientist at DEC Systems Research Center in California. Krishna holds a PhD in computer science from Georgia Tech, where he also was when Aaron was on the faculty, and a BTech in computer science from the Indian Institute of Technology in Madrid. In 2003, he won the World Technology Award for Media and Journalism, and Google News won the Webby in the news category. Krishna serves on the boards of Columbia School of Journalism and the Committee to Protect Journalists. He's also, maybe most importantly today, here because he is a parent of one of our great students, Mira Bharat, who's in the architecture program. So as he's made the point, he's not here on behalf of Google, he's on here as a parent. So I'd like to welcome Krishna, and again, thanks, Kavita, as Krishna comes up to speak.
Thank you, Dean Carmon. I'm delighted to be here in this lovely space addressing all of you about something that I believe is extremely timely and important. Normally, I represent Google, and I talk about technology and sometimes to journalists. Today, I'm super excited because of the special mix of talents gathered here. Artists and designers and architects and also technologists like me. And the reason I'm here is I'm not trying to be a spokesman for Google today. I'm here as a parent, a well-wisher of the school, a donor, who wants to see this school at the cutting edge of technology when it comes to the revolution that's coming. The AI juggernaut has been building for the last 10 years. But it revealed its creative edge in the last year. We've seen the impact it's had in terms of chatbots and the ability to compose text and create images and videos and so forth, and it's only just beginning. And what that means to the school, this profession, is something we need to consider, and I think this professorship that we started today was, to give the school an edge and some momentum in that space. So just to make the point about the creative side of AI. This dessert plate composed of chocolate and mango and fondant was not created by a chef. It was created by Imagine in about 15 seconds. And it's trying to be realistic in the sense that those pieces of mango aren't cut precisely. And how it fused this notion of an eagle with the notion of a dessert, we will never know. But that's the kind of thing that we expect our creative folk to do. So it's starting to get there. So in order to understand where we came from and where we are going, it's maybe worth rewinding a little bit. About 80 years ago, when von Neumann introduced us to the first architecture for the modern computer, just basically a stored program computer where the programmer decides what the machine is going to do, and it gets executed line by line systematically. Okay? This is by far the most common paradigm, and we want our banks and our phones and so forth to work reliably, and this is how it operates. The great thing about it is it's super reliable and constant. The bad thing about it is it's limited by the creativity of the programmer. That doesn't get any better over time, and it's limited by their imagination. Contrast that with learning machines, which also came along a little bit later. And here's an example of a machine called AlphaGo by DeepMind from Google, which taught itself how to play the game of Go. Go is one of the most popular games in the world. It's harder than chess in some ways, has more board positions. And AlphaGo first learned from pre-existing games, and then once it got past that point, it started playing against itself and became smarter and smarter until it beat the world champion. So how do these learning machines work, right? They're trying to be a bit like the human brain, loosely modeled on it. So they contain, the modern learning machines contain an artificial neural network, which is a collection of artificial neurons that are connected, like in the grid that you see there. Some input comes in from one end, maybe pixels of an image. It flows through the network with a small amount of math, almost the same kind of math at every node happens. And out comes some output. In this case, it's trying to guess what's in the image, and it might say bird. And the way we train such an artificial neural network is by giving it billions of examples, maybe labeled images. So here's an image of a bird, here's an image of a car, and so forth. Every time it guesses correctly, it gets a reward. Every time it gets it wrong, we tell it what the right answer was, and it makes it slightly more likely. It's a bit like how we learn from experience. We interact with the world. We look at content. We talk to each other. And we make advances from all of those experiences. And the information that it encounters is distilled into a set of numbers, which we call parameters. And every time it learns something, those parameters get tweaked ever so slightly. And our deep neural nets today have about 1 trillion parameters at most, whereas the brain has 100 trillion, which means in about 5 years we'll get there. But already we can do amazing things with these trillion parameters or so. So deep neural nets power most of our modern AI advances, from ChatGPT, Google Bard, DALL-E 2, and so forth, and they produce these fantastic images and interesting conversations. How does it all work, right? Let's start with ChatGPT and Google Bard and things like that. At some level, these things are like autocomplete. So if I start typing in Washington University in Google, you probably would guess St. Louis. Because if you look at the statistics, most people type St. Louis. Some people may type St. Louis fully, and some people might type Missouri. So this kind of statistics can be computed and stored. But what if you had text you've never seen before? Or you had to generate a large amount of text. You couldn't possibly build a table that contained everything you could ever imagine. So this is where the artificial neural nets are actually very helpful. Because what they do is they look at the billions of examples you give them, and rather than remembering everything exactly as it was, they start building a prediction machine. So they store the essence of what they've seen. So they might abstract from what they've seen to higher level patterns, which allows them to come up with surprising new answers. For example, with ChatGPT, if I say, write a biblical verse in the style of King James Bible, explaining how to remove a peanut butter sandwich from a VCR, it comes up with this. And it came to pass that a man was troubled by a peanut butter sandwich, for it had been placed within his VCR, and he knew not how to remove it. And he cried out to the Lord, saying, "O Lord, how can I remove this sandwich from my VCR?" For those of you who don't know what a VCR is, it's what your moms and dads used to use, before the age of TikTok. It looked like a toaster, roughly, and you would put something in it, a cassette, and it would play a movie. If you put a peanut butter sandwich, something very bad will happen. You know this now. We knew this. How did ChatGPT know this, right? So by reading a lot of text, it has come up with the concept, understood the concept to some degree, what a VCR is, what a peanut butter sandwich is, how they don't get along, and the style that is expected here, King James Bible maybe, and the fact that there is an expectation of humor. All of this is implicit and something that you and I can pick up on, and so did this machine, right? And by the way, autocomplete is not just for text. Here is The Girl of the Pearl Earring by Johannes Vermeer, and DALL-E autocompleted it by adding parts of the room that were perhaps missing. I personally think it's way more cluttered than what was there in the original, but bonus points for trying. So back to how this ChatGPT or Bard got trained, I like to think of it as having 2 steps. The first step is sort of general education, which is kind of what most students go through from K through 12 in college, which is they learn about the world without any particular task in mind, and they learn about it in detail. So these, just like in the autocomplete example, it gets shown a prefix of some text, maybe a web page or a social media post or something, maybe something in a book, and it's asked to autocomplete it, and it learns how to autocomplete it. And we do that over and over again, billions of times, and it starts to learn all these concepts. So now it's well-versed in what people write in documents, not ready to have a conversation yet. So the next step is teach it social skills. How to be a responsive and responsible chatbot. So you might give it things that people might ask for. Translate this to German, some input text, some output text. It actually already knows how to translate it. The point of this exercise is to teach it what to do and what not to do, how to be respectful, how not get into problems, states, how to have a multi-turn conversation. And once you finish that, you kind of have your GPT-4 running, inside ChatGPT. If that seems like magic, trust me, most computer scientists would agree. That is, we don't exactly know what goes on in there, how that artificial neural net represents all this. We would love to know, and we are finding out more about it, but there's a huge mystery here. Let's switch to images. Okay, so in images, what's been really powerful is neural nets that act as diffusion models to generate images. So it takes a piece of text that describes an image, like a brain riding a rocket ship heading towards the moon, generates one or more images that match that description. This is Imagen from Google. But there are many other systems, and some of them have been specialized for various kinds of things. So there is stable diffusion. Here are some examples of sort of digital illustration coming from that. There's interior design from Midjourney. And as you can see, the descriptions are now fairly elaborate. Editorial-style photo, off-center, mid-century, modern living room, Eames lounge chair, and so on and so forth, describing what's in the room, the style, the lighting, maybe some of the items in there. And this is still a black art. We don't necessarily know what works and what doesn't, but it seems to nudge the model to produce good images. Here's another one from Midjourney. It's a portrait. This woman probably doesn't exist. Synthesized from looking at a lot of photographs. Medium close-up shot off center of young French woman, brunette, so on and so forth. This is where we are headed. How do you train such a diffusion model? As I said before, ChatGPT was trained on billions of pieces of text that were given to it and asked to autocomplete. Here we do something similar. We take billions of images that are labeled. For example, this photo of a cat or a ferry boat and so on and so forth. And we teach the model, given that prompt, how to generate such an image over and over again. And then we give it brand new prompts, and then it generates these new images. I should mention that we give it about, in this example, 2 billion images, and the parameters that it has are about 4 billion. So roughly 2 numbers per image. So it's not actually memorizing the images. It's learning some general truths about what cats look like, what ferry boats look like, and so on and so forth, so that it can be creative. And I think we humans do that too. We don't remember every single experience we had. We build some kind of more abstracted view of what we experience that allows us to be creative. The way we train this model is we take that cat, for example, and we progressively degrade that picture until it becomes noise. I'm showing you this happening in 6 steps. In practice, we take about 50 steps or more. Every step is just a small degradation. And you might ask, why are we doing this? Ruining the cat. Well, the reason is because we get all these examples that we can go the other way. So we can go the other way and teach it how to go from a degraded example to a slightly less degraded example in one step. So we might take the 4th one and show it how to generate the 3rd one, which is a small step. It's almost like teaching an artist, like, here I've half finished my painting, do the next step. It just takes a little bit more. That's a smaller thing to learn than the whole going from nothing to something, right? And of course, this diffusion model will not do this out of the blue. It will attend to that description. Photo of a cat on a desk with a computer and a couch in the back. It will attend to that text and then produce a change that's appropriate given that text. Now, we talked about these large language models earlier in the context of ChatGPT. You need something like that to understand this text. So understanding language and generating images and design go hand in hand. Without a sophisticated ability to understand language, you cannot do the other creative stuff. And this is true in general. If you have a solid education that teaches you all kinds of things, that is useful when you're an artist because you bring in some of those elements. And we see the same thing. The other thing you can do with these diffusion models is you can change something that has been generated. So here's an example of changing something that's non-trivial. So you use a diffusion model to generate a scene with the boulevards with full of people, and then you want to make it less crowded. So you take the crowded token and you reduce its influence, and the image has fewer people in it. Right? This is sort of a non-trivial thing. It's not as if you're erasing one person. You could also make a bunny doll more fluffy by tweaking the fluffy parameter. The other thing you can do is this is prompt to prompt from Google. Dream Booth is another editing tool, which allows you to teach the model some object or person you care about, which could be a product you're selling, it could be a pet, it could be a family member. And once it's learned that person and what kind of object, the object and what that object represents, it's able to then generate images based on that. So it knows that that's a dog, so it can now make the dog swim underwater with its ears kind of going backwards, and how does it pose for a haircut. These are innovations on top of what it's learned for a thing that you taught it. Here's another one, Instruct Pix2Pix from Berkeley, which is built on top of prompt to prompt, where you take an arbitrary image that you could have found on the internet or you took a picture of, and then you can change it in specific ways. So you can swap sunflowers with roses, add fireworks, change what Woody looks like, change the coat of this to leather and so forth. Okay? There are many more things. These things come every month. We see a new innovation, and this is our way of saying, hey, what you generate by default isn't enough. We need the ability to tell you what to do. And you can imagine in the future something like ChatGPT, except you're working with images and designs of various sorts and telling it, hey, I want this to be changed, I want that to be changed. What's missing here is fine control, being able to exactly tune something, maybe something that we need to consider. Here is video generation based on a sequence of prompts. So each prompt is defining not one image, but a sequence of images. And we just use diffusion, one image after another. And you can see that this allows the scenes to be seamless, and also the morphing of the bear into a koala, or whatever that last thing, a panda bear. And again, this is just the notion of diffusion extended to multiple frames. And of course, on the most of the graphics and design apps on the App Store have AI in it, right? And they're becoming increasingly mass market. And I guess the question for us is, okay, we understand what end users want. What do professionals want? How does AI work into their workflow, right? So the question is, how do we co-create with AI? Right? You don't want AI to be the primary designer and you just do the final implementation. You want to co-create where the ideas come from both places, right? That's just the challenge. Here's an example of an interior designer who actually uses Midjourney to come up with her initial ideas, and then she uses that to turn it into an implementation. So you can see that it's sort of substantially the same layout, the same palette, very different materials, but the lighting is somewhat similar, so inspired by that input. And of course, there's no shortage of people dreaming up architecture, and I think you'll hear more about this from Kory's talk today. And these are, fabulous buildings. The fact that they took 15 seconds to generate blows my mind. Yes, they're two-dimensional. We're going to make them three-dimensional very soon. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about how does this intersect with the profession. Okay? I should point out that diffusion models do have limitations. So here's an example of a graphic design. And those skilled in the art know how to build things like this. Every aspect of this image has meaning, right? There's information encoded here. The sizes mean something. The colors mean something. The legends mean something. The labels mean something. It's hugely symbolic. Arrows mean something. Ditto with the heart diagram. The red means it's oxygenated blood or whatever. This is not something that diffusion model can do. You can give it this level of detail and expect it to perform. It's like this liberated artist that doesn't want to be told too much, right? That might change, but for now, I don't think this approach is necessarily going to get us here. Ditto with something like an architecture diagram, right? There's a ton of constraints that are being enforced here in terms of what the client gave you, what the code allows in terms of materials and structures and what they can bear, and norms and stylistic compatibility with what you've done in the past as your firm. Huge amount of dependency that has to be encoded. Diffusion models don't know how to do this. So if you want to do it, a better analogy is programming. So we've seen how language models like the ChatGPT and Bard and so on and so forth are effective in writing code. So when you're writing code, you have a pre-existing body of software. You're trying to add to it in a specific way. You want certain changes made, and you want to work with the system, in this case GitHub Copilot, and say, here's how I want to make a change. Can you help me? And then maybe it comes up with very creative ways, and you say, I like that one. It's working with constraints. It's making sure the code actually works and so forth. So in some sense, these language models are a closer match to the design arts than they are to the pure diffusion models. At the same time, you want the beauty and the innovation on the creative side in terms of the display. How do you get both? An example I saw recently was in GPT-4. They demonstrated how they could do it in 2 steps. They asked Stable Diffusion to generate a certain picture with a lot of constraints, and it failed. So instead, they first generated a plan using GPT-4, which they made it describe what is located in various places, and a plan that was done in SVG. And then they gave it to Stable Diffusion, and it did a fantastic job adding the art on top of it. So this is going to be perhaps the route forward. So that's where I'm going to stop. I'm going to leave you with some open questions. So here is an example of the mechanical dove made with Midjourney. Again, really remarkable. If you want to build something, it'll take months, but you can make it happen so quickly. How do I tell it? I know I can maybe talk to it and say, I want to make those feathers out of real feathers, and then maybe it'll happen. But I also want direct manipulation. Maybe I want to adjust that beak just so. Maybe I want to move that wheel somewhere else. And that kind of dual interface is going to be interesting. And also deep inside these models are all kinds of controls that we haven't even discovered. How do we find them? How do we expose them? How do we train them to do something like exposure or focus or whatever it is? And how do we expose that to the user? That's going to be an interesting question. And then, as we discussed, how do we enforce constraints, preferences, and styles? And maybe it's a 2-step process using a language model. And then lastly, who builds these models and how do they get trained? Is it going to be the tech companies? Is it going to be specialized firms? Is it going to be universities? Right? And how do these models build on top of each other? That's going to be an interesting conversation. In order to train these models, you need, firstly, a body of work that you can study. Secondly, you need professionals interacting with it, giving it feedback. I mean, I think both of which I think you can find in the professional sphere. So that's in terms of the profession. But in terms of Washington University and the campus, how do we get technologists and designers to work together, right? Building something together. So this is an example of a sculpture in the Assyrian style of a man working on a laptop, some hieroglyphs behind him, and kind of like a minotaur or something. Very unique, obviously generated very quickly using some AI. But this was done by somebody who calls themselves, I don't know, ML art engineer, somebody who combines a custom ML model with art and engineering, whatever. So maybe there are new professions that are going to be formed as technologists and designers come together. People who formerly were not that skilled with their hand are now able to program, curate, tune models that do art, and then use that as leverage to do something fantastic. Now, how do we upgrade the curriculum to reflect this? How do we bring this into our classroom? How do we train our faculty? How do we avoid them being intimidated and saying this is going to happen, let's embrace it? And the fact that even we have a head start here, that many institutions have yet to think about this, is important. The fact that even a year in this field is amazing. And then finally, how do we take the innovations that happen here and bring them into the workplace so that we can shape the profession and then you see yourself as instrumental in shaping these professions going forward? So I think it's important to be ambitious because the future belongs to those who get to invent it. And I think we have an opportunity right here to do exactly that. Thank you. Great question. I think there are, yes. So I think Carmon was asking, based on what I've seen, are we seeing creatives getting involved? I don't have as much exposure to this field, but I do have some exposure to journalism, and which is kind of an analog. And I think, they were a little bit worried about technology, and then we've seen a lot of the big newsrooms like Washington Post embrace this and get more involved, and sort of having AI in the loop is very natural. I'm sure people at Adobe are working with, with professionals in the space, and I have, as you may, OpenAI and parts of Google are also doing that. So I think it's happening, maybe not as fast as you'd like. And part of the reason is in the last 12 months has been so much progress that we've barely had time to catch our breath. But I think it's going to happen. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, is this on? Just a quick question. You mentioned explicit and implicit knowledge somewhat, and you hear a lot about black box and what the neural network knows and how it knows it, and it seems very relevant to perhaps the creative professions. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about, obviously as humans we have implicit and explicit knowledge, and where does it come from and where does it go? And obviously these neural networks are displaying both, and it seems like there's a lot of talk about how do you control. And some of your questions, you can give rules and taxonomies about do this, do that, but a couple questions in there. But final one on this maybe is prompting is perhaps the new authorship we will have over some of this stuff, versus understanding within the black box, which may not be possible.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of questions in there. He asked about implicit and explicit knowledge and the role of prompting in these systems. And I would say, like, when you train these systems, the knowledge that goes into the neural network is something we don't yet know how to understand well. We can probe it in specific ways, but we don't really understand how it's stored there. And this is a problem with language models as it is to image models. And therefore, it can hallucinate and make up things. In the case of art, I would argue that hallucination is a good thing. In the case of engineering, like professions, I think making up things that are not in the code and so forth is not a good idea. So I think we have similar challenges. But there are ways in which you can train it to do one kind of task really well in a formal way. And some of that is building it into the prompt and giving it a lot of examples. It's called few-shot learning. This is how I would respond. This is what I'd do. This is what I would not do. And there's also fine-tuning, where you give it a body of knowledge that is of things that it should do and should not do. So it's like guardrails in some respect. So there are many possibilities. In the future, we might be able to learn more about how the internals work, to expose more controls into the system that allows us to steer it better. We might be able to get the system to report more about what it's doing, so that we get a insider's view on how it's thinking. Some cases it may not matter. I mean, you might say, well, I'll be happy if 99% of the time it's right, and it throws it up, and I'll get to review it, and I'll reject the 1% that doesn't work. So a human in the loop solves a lot of these problems. I worry much more when something the system generates is just taken for granted by somebody who doesn't understand it. So which is why in professional practice, I would see this as less of an issue if the hit rate is pretty good, right? So, but still, what does it know implicitly is a big question. It's maybe a philosophical question. It's what do you know implicitly, do you know? So I don't know. Any more?
Thank you, Krishna. We'll get adjusted for our next panel with Ian and Kory. Thanks again. That was a great opening presentation. So we're right on schedule with 5 minutes really, but Ian and Kory, if you're ready, we can position you up there. Of course, everyone should feel free to come and get some sandwiches and snacks. Take a break as you like. There are bathrooms right here behind the green wall. And we'll get set up. Okay, I think we are ready to start our session. You could get settled.
Okay, welcome back. It's great to see all of you here. As Carmon mentioned, Kory and I grew up together in the 1980s, which is the decade that came before the 1990s. It's a long time ago now. I want to pick up on something Carmon brought. I wasn't going to do this, but we're now already winging it. Did you have a computer at home?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, what did you have?
My Apple II.
Apple II.
Yeah.
I remember, so we went to this kind of fancy private school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A bunch of like Sandia Labs kids, kids of engineers, that kind of thing. And there were computers at the school, even in the early 80s. TI 99s, I think we had.
Yeah.
And they made us learn Logo on these computers. And I didn't realize until years, maybe decades later, that it wasn't really about learning computer programming, although we did learn a little bit of that.
Yeah.
But like the idea that that was normal.
Yeah.
Like, oh, yeah, there are computers around, and you can program them. Which is the same with the Apple II when you booted it up, right?
Yeah.
Like a basic prompt.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Ours was in our basement, and that's where
Right.
I went. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, I don't know, the sense of creating a kind of concept of normalcy, right, around any kind of technology. And in this case, it almost feels like we're resetting
Right.
in a way.
Yeah.
So we had this AI summit a month ago, I don't know, on campus. And there's a line that I keep hearing repeated around campus. It came from one of our trustees, Gaurav Garg, and he said something like this. AI won't replace humans, but people who use AI will replace the people who don't. And you know, that's a nice line. You can do with it, maybe you object, you know, maybe you embrace it. But the reason I wanted to mention it here is that what does it mean to be a person who uses AI, actually? That's not an obvious question, really. And I think some of us have gotten the sense that, well, it means that we're all going to be like George Jetson, like pushing buttons. George Jetson is a cartoon character. Yeah. But that's not really how this feels at all. And I wanted to bring Kory in to talk to us a little bit about the actual kind of craft practice of using the contemporary tools to do, in Kory's case, architectural design, but obviously that extends to others. And you know, I think it's suggestive of some kind of success that we picked your images to like market the
Yeah. Thank you.
the event. So what were you trying to do here? What was the sort of inspiration for this run of examples?
Oh, yeah. Sure. So, yeah. I mean, just to give a little backstory on my history with text-to-image AI, I was pretty early adopter. I mean, June 2002. I think Midjourney.
June 2002 is early adopter.
Yeah,
Like
early
less than a year
adopter,
ago.
almost
Yeah.
a year ago.
Yeah.
I think April is when Midjourney like formed, but it opened up a beta kind of testing in June, which I was part of. And so yeah, I was just dabbling with maybe 2 or 3 other architects that I knew of doing this sort of stuff. But I'd post it online, and it would just generate tons of buzz, mostly angry.
Yeah.
Never in my life have I had to defriend people, like full professors, defriending them just because of the amount of rage it brought up. But so yeah, that's sort of my history, and I've just since then developed different approaches to AI, different AIs. You gave a perfect introduction. I think I'll cover some of those different tools. But this one in particular, I think, has generated a lot of recent buzz because it's the first that felt like a 3D model. You know, like I think up until, this is Midjourney version 4, so now we're at 5, but that's 4. It's the first version where it felt like this might have been modeled in a computer and maybe would fool like the average person into thinking this is not just an image, but it's actually something three-dimensional. Also, this one, you know, I think the fear out there, especially among artists, but maybe architects, is that it's using our imagery to create these new images, and there's a feeling of plagiarism and stealing. So in this particular one, I was very aware of not using any kind of style, any kind of architect, any artist in the prompt, but just describing formal qualities that I'm interested in architecture. And it's an approach I typically take. There's maybe a few examples where I do mix in an architect or artist, but in general, I find it way more interesting and also just a better trajectory if you exclude those kind of terms and include terms like, in this case, concave, convex, clusters, aggregations, even describing a little bit the colors. And when I do colors, I say things like gold ingots instead of gold, and that produces a certain kind of formality to it. So that's really, this one's sort of a series that generated from there. But also, maybe an interesting tangent is in architecture, we train on precedents.
Yeah.
So there is a fine line between plagiarism and precedent analysis, but we've sort of embraced the study of previous architecture, previous artists as part of the core of our discipline. That's what we teach, that's what we learn, that's what we use. In the past, we've figured out ways to diagram architecture. We figure out the abstraction of circulation patterns or formal logics, or even how something maybe came to be from a context. In this particular project, I wanted to do a similar approach, but using the tools of AI to generate that analysis. So I used something called Hugging Face. It's a platform that he mentioned, which is basically a platform that has a bunch of models that people have developed using mostly Stable Diffusion because it's open source. But one of those is by, and now I'm going to forget the name, but one developer within that space who does the reverse. So instead of text to image, does image to text. So I was feeding in a lot of architecture, my own architectures, even sketches to generate text from images. Like if for this one in particular, I included this art piece that I did. So I submitted it, and it's a rendering that I uploaded. And I said, what text would you use to make this art piece? And it came up with words I would have imagined, like interconnected, crystals, like all these kind of descriptive terms that I think would be reasonable to explain just graphically what the work looks like. But it also included super strange things like Selena Gomez, the singer, super weird, Texas Revolution, dark vials, really strange terms. And so I said, okay,
dark vials, like inverse hallucinations.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the computer, that's how it reads my work. That's not how I would read it. That's not how anyone human would read the work.
Right.
But let me try it. Let me throw it in there and see what it produces. And sure enough, it produced this, but also other things that were very similar to the original
So these
work.
are dark vials.
These are dark vials and Texas Revolution.
Right, which you never would have thought of.
Never would have thought of.
So you had to kind of probe what the current state of the machine learning algorithms kind of were thinking, or maybe that's not the right word for it. You're trying to figure out how these systems are representing something like thought to themselves as a way of then taking advantage of them.
Yeah.
Did you have was this experimental, or did you have an actual design goal, or at least even if it's a hypothetical one?
No, just totally experimental.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm always interested in housing. So in this particular one, looking at new forms of housing, collective, living that's not what we see in most corners, stacked repetition.
Right.
So looking for variation within the cluster of housing models. So architecturally, that's what I was looking for, but also just experimenting.
Let's take a look at another one. So this series kind of continued that idea of using pattern or formal properties.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, this one, so this is Midjourney version 2. This is, I still think, the most creative version of Midjourney. This one was really the summer was when it was taking off, July, August. But I'm really interested in this question of control. Like, as an architect, how do I have some control over the output? How can I start to understand and predict what that output might be based on what I'm feeding the computer? So in this case, I was thinking of patterns that we're familiar with, and in this particular case, camouflage. We understand the organizational form of camouflage. It's different colors mixed together, and we understand what that might look like graphically. And so I use that as the kind of guiding, the sort of you can weight prompts. So that had the heaviest weight in this particular series. And what was interesting, and what I prefer, I think, about Midjourney 2 is that it was a journey back then. Like now it gives you the output very quickly, which we'll talk about a little later. But this one took probably 6,000 iterations to get through.
Yeah.
And so it began with camouflage. It began with tanks. Like this building had tanks in it. It had artillery, it had greens, like just graphic camouflage over a building. But as the way Midjourney works is you get 4 images back. You have the choice to upscale any of those 4 or all of the 4, or you can vary them. I can do 4 variations of the first one. And you just kind of go through this process. So upscaling increases the resolution of the image, and by increasing resolution can add more detail. There's more pixels to work with. And so you go through this kind of journey of like adding detail, curating really the image. And so after 4,000 versions or 5,000 iterations, the green camouflage color started to become plants.
Yeah.
And the white and tan started to become limestone and material, real architectural materials. Glass, the whites became glass. And so the architecture kind of evolved just through the curation of the thing.
I want to drill down on a couple things from this example. The first is, as Krishna mentioned, it's like you push a button and 15 seconds later you get an image. That's very much the case, but what you're describing is a much longer process. Like, can you describe the duration of that process for you as a creator across those many thousands of iterations?
Yeah, I think it's a background. It's a foreground approach at the very beginning, and then it becomes a background approach.
You go get lunch. Yeah.
For weeks,
Right.
months.
Right.
I mean, like you'll see, I don't really. It takes me probably 3 weeks to produce an image that I'm happy with versus just outputting everything. Right. So it's a long process, yeah. And it's. I just told you we're sitting down. I looked this morning, and maybe it's embarrassing to say, but I've made 46,000 images on Midjourney, which is a lot.
Right.
That's a lot of images. But I would say it's taken up maybe 10 hours of my time.
Right. Over a long period.
Over a long period of time.
And in between those moments where you're touching the computer, you're thinking and reflecting and doing all the normal work of creative practice, right?
That's right.
So in some ways, it's maybe like a red herring to say that the machine is going to just output a jillion versions without our involvement, because you've had to be very, very involved in order to tune it to the point that you get results that are interesting to you. Yeah. Right, and interesting to us to look at. The second thing that I wanted to ask about here is like this sort of idea of co-creation or collaboration, of working with the machine as a collaborator. These tools work the way that they're designed to work. With Midjourney, if you just try out Midjourney, you go into a Discord channel, and the first time you use it, you get thrown in with like 1,000 other random people making anime images mostly, so like how would you as a designer design the way that you interface with a system like Midjourney based on if you could kind of go and change anything about how it worked from the perspective of the creative process?
Yeah, it's funny. I think I would have answered this question very differently like 3 months ago and than I would today, because today there's just so many tools and so many different ways. So, there's some things that I didn't send you that I'm working on where you're starting to finally connect the different models for AI. So, before Midjourney, before the text-to-image, we were using Runway ML, which is another collection of a lot of different AI models. One in particular was style transfer, where you would take an image of me and say, draw it like an image of Van Gogh, and then boom, you get Van Gogh. So there's a lot of those kind of things that were very specific in their use. Yeah. And there are even more of those now that can interface with this. So for me, it's really about collaborating between the multiple models, figuring out when I need a particular model. It's become more complicated. Right. I think before it was more simple, and you'll see a lot of the kind of earlier stuff I was doing was trying to control the output, so I had some control over it. I could predict it a little bit. Now I don't need to so much, because I can start to like blend an image. Like I can take an image that is more formally what I'm looking for, and I can take an image that's creating some of the conditions I'm happy with, but not in the right form. And I could say, let's actually start to bring those two closer together, where this starts to take on some of the form of this image. You can erase parts of images that you're not happy with and just keep iterating on that particular moment. You could easily, this would take a while, but probably no longer than it would to model, in 3D. But you can start to erase, add, outpaint, inpaint, different components to produce, I think, a pretty accurate image of what you as a designer might want to.
And again, like what you're describing is so different from, I think, the kind of common view that people get of AI, which is this push button, George Jetson sort of mentality. You're talking about technique, basically.
Yeah, I think there's, Chigori, I forget her last name, but she was part of Stability AI and Stable Diffusion. She was in Acadia recently in a panel, and she mentioned as a developer of the software, she's seeing all this stuff come through, and made note that the best designers still produce the best AI output, the best artists still produce the best art output. And so I think there's still a correlation between the output one chooses and selects throughout the process and the knowledge one has gained through decades or years of education, experience, knowledge about its discipline. Because a lot of that comes not only in how you construct a prompt, like if you know more about a particular field that you're trying to gear a prompt towards, that knowledge helps for sure, but also just in curation. I mean, we're in a museum space, like the quality of a curation is not something that can be automated.
Right.
Right.
Right. There's another thing you mentioned here, which is that you preferred, was it version 2? This is Midjourney still, right? Yeah, version 2 of Midjourney, which somewhat disrupts the idea that as engineering makes improvements to the systems and the models that they're using, that it always produces better output. Can you say a little bit more about that sentiment? Was it the slowness, or was it something else?
No, I think so. This is me guessing. I think there's still the black box, the dark magic that's like what I do, is try to figure out what's happening there. And my theory about it would be that in the later versions, I mean, these companies they're looking for a majority of quality output. So in version 2, the output does not look as good because 98% of the people doing it stop after 5 iterations, and it's just not that good yet. In Midjourney 5, 4, and 5, 3 outputs later, and you have a pretty articulated, well-designed project. And so I think if it's serving, these are service platforms. You pay for Midjourney.
Right.
So it wants the best results from the majority of people. So 95% of people are getting good output now, as opposed to maybe 5% earlier. I think the problem, though, is when it understands features. Yeah. So from this noise, it's constructing images based on features. So if you say, I want to create a building, you don't need to say, I want windows, I want a roof, I want doors. It knows all that stuff. It understands that there are things associated with a word in your prompt that should also be associated with the image it constructs. I think that gap is shrunk in 4 and 5. So that the windows are more window-like, doors are more door. In version 2, I think it would take the shape of things more, but still use your prompt to fill them in. So if you wanted a bird with a beak that was made out of a balloon, it might still be it might be more bird-like still, beak-like, than balloon-like, and now it will just be a balloon.
And you felt that gave you more opportunities to intervene and sort of fine-tune the results that you were getting?
And curate, and I think make prompts that were more mixed and actually more used, I would say, throughout the prompt than now, which it really heavily favors things that are at the beginning of the prompt, and will try to direct the rest of the form into those things that it already understands. There's like a tipping point, though, because like with the bird balloon beak example, it knows if you want a balloon as a beak, it'll just do that. Right? It's not going to try to form it into the beak anymore. And so it's become less exploratory, less design-oriented, I would say, but more predictable. I mean, DALL-E was this way to begin with.
Sure.
DALL-E was very realistic, very precise with what you would ask of it, but that's why creatives didn't pick up on it. There was no, you just would get what you put in.
But it does suggest that in this space, in this AI plus design space, there's an opportunity for kind of 1,000 flowers blooming and a variety of tools, not just the ones that we're getting from the large platform companies to serve as many people as possible. Because it's like very difficult and expensive to train the models to do what you want, which is maybe something that we can come back to. Let's move on.
Real quick, I think that's interesting because most even small groups that are developing models around AI are using the same checkpoint. Like Stable Diffusion, which is billions of images. Even Midjourney uses it now. So it's how you carve up that data set, which is really what makes one different from the other. I mean, we're talking about billions of images. So you could argue it could capture most of anything in the known world, anything that's photographed or image-based. But yeah, it's how do you actually carve up that information?
And are you seeing that as sort of like a technique? Like, okay, how do I carve up this conceptual space into image space? Like when you sit down, this is a different example, but when you sit down and you're thinking, I'm interested in I'm interested in exploring camouflage as a formal design property, or I'm interested in designing some facades that have glass and organic growth.
Yeah, camouflage as a design property.
As a design property,
Yeah.
right? And that's sort of what you mean by carving out a part of the image set as a.
I mean, if we're talking about what's next, the future of AI, what I would like to see as a designer, it would be the ability to tag information according to our disciplines. So like right now, a door is a door, a window is a window, but like here I learned that we should call them apertures, because doors might be windows, windows might be doors, and it was like lesson 101. And I think that's interesting because we all have our own jargon, our own terminology.
That's right.
And once we understand that terminology of that field or that discipline, we can better control what we can predict as the output, as opposed to like ignoring everything.
Well, it's in the language model, since they are language driven, you're right, using whether it's specialized language or jargon, or whether it's just language that's used in a particular way, right? Like the way that aperture denotes in architecture versus photography.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly right. That's why you'll find a lot of Zaha Hadid examples, but not a lot of Frank Gehry examples. I mean, it's gotten better, but because Frank could be hot dogs. Frank could be.
Right.
There's thousands of Franks. Zaha Hadid, there's fewer of them, so it knows that particular.
So it
tag.
just makes it natively easier to get Zaha Hadid output.
Right.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Let's talk about this example because it's already come up a little bit. So the image on the left is a mid-journey image, right? Created in much the same way as the previous one, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And then the image on the right is essentially an outpainting, such as the one we saw earlier with the Vermeer.
Yeah.
But everything that I think it was Dolly on the right came up with was sort of hallucinated, right? I mean, can you tell us a little bit about the process of making this and what surprised you?
Yeah, this was super surprising. I think because I saw the Vermeer example, it was going around, and I said, that sounds really interesting. I want to know what it thinks about the context, because one thing these are not good at is context, and as architects, we're interested in context, like we're designing buildings for a particular location. So how does it understand context, which is the surroundings of the image? So yeah, I did use outpainting in Dali very soon after it was released, and I did not get a good, I didn't get the Vermeer qualities. I got the 80s pop qualities, and I have no idea why. But yeah, I found it super interesting because if this image is 7 feet by 7 feet at 300 dpi, so this is a high resolution image. I was generating cells that were very small. I actually used Topaz Labs to increase the resolution of the seed image, which is basically an upscaling software. So that's one thing I was really interested in, creating a very high resolution, very articulated image using DALL-E to outpaint that entire surrounding. So yeah, I mean, it's amazing, the kind of structures it generated. It does repeat itself. So I think when you work in ChatGPT, for example, it's predicting something, and this is similar, and it's predicting what's next. The problem with the image-based is it's predicting it based on its previous pixels that are in the region that it's looking at. Mm-hmm. So if you keep it, like if I were to do the Vermeer one, you would want to outpaint just a little bit at a time, like a few pixels. Uh-huh. And this one I'm outpainting 98% of the cell. So that's why it deviates so quickly.
Were there questions, when you saw this happen, you're like, oh, there's sort of this kind of interesting synthwave thing happening, which I didn't expect. What sorts of questions did that suggest to you, either about using the system or about the sort of design grammar that you were working in?
I don't know. I mean, to me, I could have kept going. I think what was so exciting about this is that it wasn't, I had another one. So I did another one right before this that I did not share with you, that essentially glitched out in every direction.
Yeah.
And it just started reproducing itself. Uh-huh. Like it didn't change. It just started, I was like, okay, that's a problem. But this one, using the exact same process and technique, did not do that. It just kept inventing things. Like every part of this image is totally different. And there was something there, and I think it was in maybe the formal, like because I used a more organic starter shape, it continued to reproduce organic architectures versus the other one, which had more rigid orthogonal architectures, and it started to glitch on those and produce repetition, and just like spread out repetition. But yeah, I think maybe there's something that it likes about that kind of fluidity of form because it is filling, it's coming from a noise map, right, that's broken down from mostly organic forms. And so maybe it's able to read and evaluate that better. I don't know. I'm speculating.
Yeah, no, right.
Yeah.
But it's almost like there are, the computer thinks there are aesthetic adjacencies that we wouldn't normally think of. Maybe whether they are or aren't there is subjective anyway, in some sense, and it's shown you, hey, I think that that's the case.
Yeah.
It's almost like you have to perform like some kind of like art history of the machine's hallucinations, right? Like this kind of alien art history to get where it's coming from. There's something for someone to take on. So one of your concerns, as you've already mentioned, has been about control and trying to hold things fast while also letting the machine fill in the blanks. And these are some examples, the sort of letter form examples, and then the surface texture of this installation that you just did at, or was it Toronto?
Calgary.
It's Calgary. So can you tell us like what made you select these letter forms as a control experiment?
Yeah, this was maybe the most interesting exercise I've embarked on because, as I mentioned, as an architect, I'm interested in the form of things. And we all know what the form of characters are. We know what an A looks like. We know what a B looks like, roughly. We know what a C looks like. So I did an entire alphabet with very little information in the prompt just to see what patterns they would generate. And I started with, by default, most of these AIs produce squares. And so I did squares, like a whole alphabet of A, B, C, where it just produces one letter. But then I got interested in, when you make a prompt, you can change, especially in version 2, where you could pretty much do any size image you wanted in terms of resolution. I said, what if you do one that's not a square, but more of a horizontal format? And it starts to reproduce itself, which is kind of interesting. So you see, like in the letter J, there's different J's, and it varies between the J's. Letter C starts to create these other structures. So that to me is interesting, where it contains some of the form of the letter, but also it starts to deviate a bit from it. And so I did a whole alphabet of these things, and actually modeled three-dimensionally. I mean, that's the other thing I learned here. I tried to model three-dimensionally some of the other stuff coming out of Midjourney 2. And what's interesting is, when you make those images, they're based on sometimes images that are orthographic views, sometimes images that are 50 millimeter lenses, sometimes images that were taken from 22 millimeter lenses. So as it starts to compose these images, it's not collaging. So it's not, chipping or cutting and pasting pieces of images, but there is some bias, I think, toward the way in which an image was constructed or photographed.
Yeah.
And when you start to stitch those together, it looks complete, but when you start to model them, it doesn't work at all.
And just to be clear, when you say you were modeling them, you were taking these images and creating 3D models based on them.
That's right.
Right. And that's where you found the gaps.
Yeah, I found major gaps when I do perspective images. Like you would have total, like if you tried to match a 3D model to the image you're getting, impossible in most cases.
And this is another one of these big questions about how, there's a lot of folks looking at the advances and the rapidness of the advances and saying, just wait, it's all going to work itself out. And maybe that's the case. Yeah. But you found that you actually have to do like quite a bit of sort of massaging and manipulation in the interim to get something usable.
That's right.
From a design perspective, usable rather than as a piece of visual art which you can post on Reddit or something.
That's right. Yeah. So for these, I found that a plan view, for example, a top-down view, much more. It's much easier to actually make a three-dimensional model of that thing than something that's built in perspectival view.
Right.
So that was also part of the approach here, is how do I create something that can easily be translated three-dimensionally while still retaining the formal structures, the qualities of that image. So I three-dimensionally modeled quite a few of these, turned a few into houses, which was fun. Pretty interesting houses, to be honest. But yeah, I like that particular quality of it. I think with version 5, which is out now, it's actually much more close to what you would model.
Yeah, I think
a
we
lot
have
of those
some examples later on.
All those gaps have
those.
been removed. And then the bottom right, so that's in Calgary. They have an interesting program where they basically shut down for a week, invite people to come teach for 1 week. And so I taught using AI to create an architectural installation. So we used some of the two-dimensional techniques that I developed in version 2 to create the form. So creating different text from different angles, extruding it in different ways. And then we wrote a script in Grasshopper to actually construct the thing out of metal. And then the outside is a surface that was generated through outpainting, actually in-painting in this example, in DALL-E. So I think what's pretty amazing, if you look closely at these things, it just produced like bunnies, which I have no idea why.
So you gave DALL-E the form of the structure.
Yes,
the three-dimensional
unfolded form of the structure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they gave you
And
bunnies.
the students generated the exterior, everything outside of that form, and then AI in-painted on that surface. So
Right.
everything that's on graphic on this piece was AI generated, in-painted from whatever the outside sources were. So maybe some students had bunnies out there, I don't know.
Right.
But if you look closely, really, really strange kind of graffiti that it generated.
Fascinating. And you can imagine how that might work in an environment where, the site or whatever it is then kind of the inspiration for the design object. And in this case, who knows what you're going to get back from the machine, but it's going to be very different than what we get from a bunch of humans in a design competition.
That's right. In that case, you give it the context, and it produces the infill.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It also makes me think that in the case of buildings or any kind of structure, any kind of permanent or semi-permanent structure, we may end up with these kind of weird accidental artifacts of the current state of AI generativity, like out in the material world. In the same way that we do with how building construction works at a moment in time.
Our contractors will be even more angry at us when they're building a little blip up there that was part of the AI model.
Who was thinking?
Who did this?
So these are not. We wanted to show some examples that were not architectural design. These are posters. There are posters for events, essentially, but entirely AI generated.
Yeah.
How did you go about producing these?
So the only thing not AI generated is the names. So we replaced the names with the actual names.
Yeah, because if you haven't tried this, the image generators are very bad at producing text. You get this stuff that looks just like alien writing or whatever.
Yeah.
Right? So you took that, you left, and then you
didn't change the location of text, any of that, but did change the actual names. But everything else is AI generated, and I think this is also an example of where version 2 is much more interesting than version 4 or 5. We tried the same thing. I mean, we just did this exhibition or this symposium, and we tried it in 4. 5 wasn't quite out. The graphic is horrible. I mean, the 2D graphics that are coming out now, if you ask for a poster, are like bad branding, corporate branding stuff. So it would be like do a symposium on AI architecture, and it would be like
a Sprite commercial,
circuits, and like
Right.
Tron-like things, and just really, really bad. But 2 is still really interesting. So those are still done in version 2. Where it's much more abstract. I think it's because it doesn't assign so much precision to the features. It allows for more looseness within that world. It just produces, I think, more useful, more interesting results.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's like you can see in the one on the right, you can also change. What also became interesting is you can change a prompt midstream. So the poster, I guess, would be in the upper left. You can see a little house in there. So part of the prompt, actually the prompt is written on the poster in the bottom left, but we include houses of the future and stuff like that, but keep it abstract, keep it two-dimensional graphic. And so you start to see shapes of those kind of things appear. If this were later versions or DALL-E or Stable Diffusion, you'd see a dumb house,
Right.
But that kept it abstract, and then we'd change that particular word for another poster and get a different result, like constructivist sculpture or something.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this whole conversation is the accident of these techniques, given the moment that the technology is at.
Yeah.
And not just closing that gap between intention and output, which is maybe the obvious thing, but also leaving it open, right? In terms of how designers and artists and technologists will work together. Some of it is about leaving space rather than trying to close it down to produce testable outcomes, or marketers are using it now, so let's do whatever the average output will be.
My fear, by the way, is that they do start closing those platforms. Like Midjourney is kept open 2, 3, 4, and 5, so you can change which one you're using. But I could see
eventually they'll retire one.
I could see a day where they don't want. I mean, I already know it's coming because they gave a lot of subscription models during 2 and 1 that are no longer financially viable,
right?
But where they're locked into for like a few years,
right?
Like I'm in one of those, and I know they're trying to get rid of them. They send me messages constantly.
Don't you want to upgrade?
Please change to this one.
Yeah, but in your case, that wouldn't be an upgrade.
Yeah, it would not be an upgrade.
Yeah,
so I think they'll start to eliminate, which will make it even more important that we gain control over how we extract from that data set, how we use that data set, how we start to intervene with these models, because if those disappear, we might not like the new ones as much. Or they might be better, I don't know.
Well, I mean, the amount of money it takes to create and then to run these systems and put them in the hands of very few organizations. Have you thought at all about what universities or what other kinds of organizations might do to construct alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, you probably saw the letter going around.
Right.
Elon Musk, Steve.
Wait 6 months.
Yeah, wait 6 months. Yeah, I think that's probably more wait 6 months because we're not quite there yet.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Like
yeah, give me a minute,
released ours.
then I'll release mine.
Yeah, let us get in front of you.
No, it's not about slowing down with
It's not about that. So my hope is things like Stable Diffusion, which is an open source
version.
I love Google Colab because it's so interactive. I've worked in that space a lot.
It is very different, though. I mean, I guess CAD tools, Grasshopper, like so much of what we use are corporate created, but it does feel different than like, well, here's a pencil. But the way that you're using it has to do with the material properties of a basic tool in a way, which maybe no one's looking out for on the teams that are making these systems.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, we're kind of like going back over the same paths here and iterating on some of your technique. In these cases, I think this is an example of where the windows and the doors, Midjourney knows what to do when it creates a house. But in this case, it's like, well, what if part of the house was a sponge?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, on this one I was interested in, okay, what if I have a conceptual idea about what a house could be? We're in a drought in Texas all the time, it seems, and it's only becoming a bigger issue. So yeah, what do you start, let's use this as a creative tool to really think about what could that be. In this case, I'll say I did use an artist in the creation of this. Can you guess who?
Anyone?
Artist, not architect. I used Tara Donovan for that one. So just out of curiosity, like what would a house as a sponge be by Tara Donovan? And only one of the houses in this particular case. So do a group of cluster of housing, one of them designed by her, the other one's out of steel. So I was curious, like what if you start to cross disciplines in this exercise? I've used like some graphic designers for architecture just to see. I'm really uninterested in what that might produce, like way too much Zaha Hadid out there, to be honest. And so I'm really interested in what if you start connecting other disciplines. Like that's one thing that the Hugging Face is really interesting because it gives you feedback that is people who are completely, I've never heard of in different disciplines. So it's really interesting to plug your work into it and say, AI, what work does this resonate with you in your database? And it returns people that I've never heard of, like super interesting artists, architects, computer programmer was one for one of the ones that came back. So I think in that there's some value in understanding how it connects with other disciplines, but also people I don't know, not the same people over and over again.
Yeah.
But other artists that I'm not familiar with.
Yeah, which is in a way the opposite of the concern about stealing work.
Yeah, precedents. It's always like we're trying to break down the use of the Western canon for everything.
Sure.
So,
but in some cases, you may not know who the precedents are that have inspired you directly or indirectly.
That's right.
And the machine's helping you figure it out.
And it might not be who you think it is, and usually it's not, which is kind of interesting.
This is a similar example, but maybe one that's a little more, easier to see the kind of replacement. Did you start? Was this a generated house, or did you start with when you replaced the roof with sponge? Was the original form generated in the same batch, or did you take that from something else?
This is the same batch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this actually began with suburban house, single family, and it actually developed. I changed the prompt at some point to add collective housing, and so this was one of the earlier ones, I would say. Still probably 1,000 iterations in. Maybe the one we just looked at was 3,000 iterations in, but. Yeah, it's part of that.
But in principle, this is effectively an entirely generated image, but it would be possible to take a photograph or something and use it and say, I want to reimagine this entryway or this portal. Because it doesn't have to be like an all or nothing affair, right? Where we're either doing everything with AI or nothing. There's a lot of space in between as well.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's becoming, we were just talking at lunch, there's a company, I don't know them, so I don't want to mention it, but they're working in interior design, and they've developed something where, yeah, you can have a 3D model and actually connect AI into it, where it can construct three-dimensional aspects of the environment. They're really basic, like it's wood, walls, you know.
Yeah.
It's what you would expect
It's
in
what you would
interior
expect.
design, so it's not branching out into different
Yeah.
territory, but it's here. You know, I think the 3D, it's here, and it's going to be here very soon. So I could imagine a time when you're going back and forth, you know, in a time in like 4 months,
Right.
where you could go back and forth between a 3D model and one of these surfaces and actually, you know, work more iteratively between the two.
The thing that's harder still is getting from that to an actual built environment.
Yeah.
Right, where you'd have to come out, well, can I source this material or something?
Yeah,
Is
right.
it viable
Right.
to construct with?
Right. Yeah, you have to wonder if, I mean, our industry is so much based on standardization and, you know, the fabrication of material and the sizes it's made in. So you'll have to wonder if there one day will be a translation between those two.
Let's skip a couple of these. There's so many great designs. I want to cover a couple, and then maybe we can take some questions. Let's see. Yeah, tell us a little bit about this one, because this was one you were.
Yeah, this was this is what I just mentioned with the blending of images. So in this one, I used, I should have sent you the original ones, but I created a section, like an architectural section drawing, and blended that. So one I created, not AI generated. One I drew that was fairly simple, you know, some stacked volumes, and then I combined it with a prompt and an image I generated in Midjourney. And Midjourney now can blend images, and you can use them to control, you know, how one starts to fill in the other. Or you can actually blend up to 5 images, which in this case I think it's 4. So it's the original section, and then one with wood, one that was kind of bird-like structure I did, and another one, and this kind of becomes the result of that blending. Again, you have to iterate many, many times.
The result is very synthetic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you can't really tell which.
Which is kind of shocking, because I think a lot of times we assume that it's hallucination. Like I put in a prompt, I got back this, some weird stuff happened, but in this case you're kind of harnessing the different horses of weirdness.
Yeah.
Trying to get them to work together.
Yeah, this is not just generated. This
Right.
is definitely not the button. This is a lot of crafting, a lot of composition. But what's amazing is, like, once you get to that point, as a creative, it feels original. I know no one's going to reproduce that image.
Yeah.
Because it's not a seed. It's not something.
And it took
it's
you
not a
1,000
prompt.
steps
Someone
to
is
get
like,
there.
"What's your prompt you used?" It's
Right.
not a prompt you can copy and get to there with. And so I really like that direction that this is headed, where you can really use your creativity, engage AI, and start to create something new that's entirely original.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because there has been this sort of idea that like so-called prompt engineering becomes a role that solves. I've never believed it, but you know, seeing your work shows just how false a dream that really is. That I'll just come up with the right sentence and then get back what I want. That kind of magical thinking, even with technology such as this, doesn't really work.
I think you can end up in a good place with any prompt that you give it. Any prompt.
So it's really about being
It's
committed
the
to the
curation.
process.
Yeah, it's the curation, and then making decisions along the way that connect other AI into it at very opportunistic moments.
Yeah.
Whereas a designer, you intervene to guide it in a direction that's like achieving some result that you want.
Can we take some questions? Okay.
Yep. Chandler.
One of the important things that was stated was someone had mentioned that, you know, good artists, good designers produce good AI-generated work. And so it then leads me to think about education and how we introduce these tools, right? So we're approaching them now, everybody, because the tool is so new, we have background information, we have kind of context that we're working from that we can then judge.
Yeah.
But as we start to think about introducing these tools to people who are just starting out in design, you know, it's a question of how do we teach that curation and kind of analysis and kind of critique of the work.
Yeah, I introduced it for the first time this semester, and I'm sure a lot of other faculty have also introduced it. And I think we're doing it a little bit wrong, which is that we're introducing it at the beginning as a sketch tool, which is what I've also done and now realize I think is wrong, because it's like I mentioned earlier, it takes so long, for me anyway, to get to a place that I think is really beyond what I would have come up with just as a standard design process. It's really by month 2 that the images start to come out in a way that's really interesting. Like I've now given it to 3 different classes of students, and I haven't seen any results that I'm like blown away by within the first 2 weeks. And that's about when we've been using it, like the sketching then. And there's a huge translation. It just becomes like a sketch and then a translation. And there's usually a huge gap between the image and what people come up with. So I'm kind of thinking now, how do we use this at the beginning but actually don't really use it until the end? Like how can we create these 2 processes that have a goal that's somewhere near the end, the last third of the semester where they might meet and then start to integrate? I think that's maybe right now anyway the more interesting approach. Maybe that starts to really connect the 2. Like that's what I tried to do in Calgary, although it was 5 days. So day 3, they started day 1 and they started something else day 1, and then they kind of came together day 3 and then really quickly put it together. But it was more interesting, I think, because the AI generated content directly related to the formal conditions of the project versus just a sketch that then gets translated through different ways to something else. Both, I guess, have value, but I think I'm more interested in that.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this is just it's so different. It's really the opposite of the standard line, this is going to replace artists or whatever, No, like you actually are going to need this background, and then you can amplify it and kind of become superpowered, in a way.
Yeah, I'm not worried about that at all. I mean,
Right.
I think we've seen it before in computer software. Like I was looking just out of curiosity because I learned Form Z here in 1995, and it was just launched in 1991. So this is very new at that point, and it was really the first 3-dimensional sketch tool. The AutoCAD had been there since the 80s, but it was really used for 2 dimensions. And then, this had been in development since the 60s with Sketchpad, I think it was called, or something like that. So there's a really long gap between when it was first introduced and all the way until Form Z. And then just quickly after that, 96, Maya came around, 2001, I think it was 3ds Max, Softimage in there. And I went to Columbia after here, which was like where they had the paperless studios. We really were embracing computation and computer software. There was an explosion at that point, and now I don't know any professional practice that does not rely on CAD. I imagine the same kind of trajectory here. You showed a great timeline of where AI started a while ago, and then we are definitely in a sea change where it's happening very rapidly. Feels very much like the early 2000s with computer software. The difference is the accessibility and the ease of use is so profoundly different now with this kind of stuff than with computer software that I imagine this will become ubiquitous in a year where every office will somehow be engaging with this tool.
Aaron?
So I think a lot about the analogy to photography. Volume is rarely my problem. I think a lot about photography. Sort of the ability of the things that everybody carries around in their pockets to do a lot of the technical parts of photography has resulted in an explosion of really awful photographs, right? And for those of us who are semi-pros or whatever, there's this question of when is anybody going to learn what makes a good photograph?
Yeah.
And there is this question of whether AI incorporates, because somebody asked this question about sort of teaching the ability to have the right eye, to have et cetera. Yeah. But AI potentially might be a little different in the sense of saying, dude, you just took this photograph. Here's what it would take for this to be a way better photograph.
Yeah.
So the question then becomes is, hey, you just kind of, generated this sketch here's what it would take to actually be a way better example. So instead of it being a tool that is sort of for the, I don't want to say for the masses, but instead of being a tool that just allows, what I would say, sort of the casual production, maybe it becomes a tool that allows a casual producer to produce much more output with greater sophistication. And what do you think, what will be necessary to get to that point?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I just finished a paper about the photograph, and I think it's Walter Benjamin. Talks about the introduction of the photograph, and then Man Ray. There was a big rejection of it, obviously, especially in the art discipline. But then Man Ray at some point in the 50s said, you can't even think about art without photography anymore. And I think it took a long time, but eventually got to the point where it became ubiquitous within that. But I do think that it becomes about then the critique, the curation. Yeah, I think exactly right. How do you critique these images in a way that you use all that expertise we have to evaluate the things we're producing, and then how you translate that expertise to others? I mean, as architects, we're constantly I wouldn't say convincing, but we're constantly having discussions with clients who are uneducated within the things we do, and so they're looking at us for expertise. We have to train and teach them very quickly on why we make one decision over another decision. I do think this tool is really interesting because they can start to collaborate with you in that exercise. Like if you can figure out a way to embed it in the process, embed them in the process, embed whole communities in the process, then we can start to participate in a way where people feel like they have an investment in the creative aspect of the architecture, which maybe, I mean, we were talking about last night, I think the stat is like only 30% of buildings have architects involved in them. And that the fear is maybe that gets to 15, but maybe actually it starts to expand if we see our role in the process a little bit differently. Like it might be that architects start to have a new consulting kind of position within other kinds of work that we aren't typically part of. That might be interesting in a way that we can start to collaborate.
I'm not sure who's next. Krishna's next. Okay.
Hi.
Everything I said was wrong.
And then I thought there's somebody behind me. I wanted to dispel the notion that training these models are going to be incredibly expensive, partly because of what Kory said. Like, stable diffusion is a great checkpoint, and you can just fine tune it in ways that make you very different from everybody else, right? So, what is the notion of an ML artist and ML architect? I think something will happen, right? Where you end up taking something like this and training it on a special collection that you identify with, or maybe your company produces, or in your style, or in with the vocabulary you care about,
right,
and the knobs you care about, which means a lot of curation, a lot of labeling, feedback, until you end up in a different checkpoint that is very uniquely yours, right? And then even coming back to this push button thing, I don't think push button is terrible. It's just terrible with the default software, right? So once you've curated it, and then you say, now I'll write the prompt using the special words I like to use and that the model understands. Right. And now you can get very quick reward for your investment. And so I think that may be the future, right? So a combination of ML and architecture, ML and art, produces highly bespoke models that you end up using.
Yep.
There's a firm called Coop Himmelblau in Austria that developed an AI model called Deep Himmelblau, trained only on its projects. And that's exactly what it's doing. It's producing more of its own projects within its own vocabulary. I mean, it's really rudimentary, but I could see definitely firms doing stuff like that.
Okay, that's a good moment for, we're right on time for our break. You have 7 minutes. Let's thank Kory and Ian here. Sharvari and Chandler are going to lead the next session. As I mentioned, Machinic and the Muse creativity, AI and creativity. So that'll start right at 2:15.
I think it finally got to me.
Sorry, you got right in the...
have nothing to put the thing.
Okay, we're going to get started for our next session. Nice and loud, huh? If you're thirsty, there are water fountains on this side other than coffee, just to let you know. Sorry, no cold drinks right today. We will at the end, though, for reception, so keep hanging in there till the end of the day. Okay. I hope you brought sunscreen. Changing light conditions. Yeah.
Right in your eyes.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Sharvari and to Chandler.
I've got lovely here. All right, thanks everyone for coming out. Unfortunately, as Carmon mentioned, Constance Vale is on an airplane somewhere, and so I'm going to do my best Constance Vale here. Good to the next slide. And so today I'm joined by Sharvari Mahtre, lecturer here, and unfortunately Matthew Allen is not able to attend as well. Also on a plane somewhere. And so today we're going to be showing some slides of undergraduate work that relates to AI from courses on this panel and the visiting professor Carol Klein, who unfortunately was not able to make it today. So we've entered an epoch of mechanic hallucinations, wherein alien intelligences produce otherworldly images. Hallucinating is closely tied to creativity, seeing things that are not physically present or that do not yet exist. We humans can get stuck in closed loops of knowing that are detrimental to dreaming, imagining, and creating the unknown. AI doesn't know. Its methods are rooted in mimicry rather than the sort of theoretical understanding at the core of human intelligence. AI defamiliarizes. It detaches whatever it produces from the weighty context of culture, and thus, quoting Carol, makes the world wholly aesthetic. So AI-generated images have an uncanny precision that might even lead us to mistake these artificially intelligent dreams for reality. And these images can proliferate more rapidly than ever before without human invention, working like and potentially with other algorithmic modeling tools to produce near infinite variations, spinning beguiling webs, realities of their own. In this capacity, AI operates as a muse, rendering what we know too well to dream. This hallucinatory dream is spilling over into our physical environments as they are being embedded with interactive technologies that transform space itself into an interface that morphs over time. And I want to let this run for a little bit. Okay. Autonomous vehicles, Autobots, and a ballet of other robotic agents populate every corner of our world, producing a blurred gradient of consciousness and carrying with them the dawn of a new aesthetic of non-human utility that will become a pervasive aspect of the built environment. That is to say, Today, our vision of architecture is designated not for the care and habitation of people, but as a utopia of and for objects. Such predictions suggest how architects, artists, designers, and engineers might engage in the new form of collaborative world building with our uncanny co-inhabitants. It's loading. Architecture, art, and design operate more broadly and with more urgency than familiar tropes of genius, art for art's sake suggests. To design and make is a political act, an act of collectively building the future, of telling stories to one another of who we are and who we want to be. World building is at the core of our disciplines. As architects, artists, designers, engineers, we rely on the enabling fiction of mediation to lure ourselves and others into worlds heretofore unimaginable. And we have increasingly robust tools, particularly AI, at our fingerprints. Such world building also dominates the development of emerging technology, wherein the socio-technical imagination is predictive and catapults innovation. To impactfully contribute to contemporary narratives of fictions, it is not enough to use technology, and we should seek to reimagine technology's spatial potential. Excellent.
Thanks, Chandler. So I'm going to be kind of presenting a little bit of the work that's been done in two of the seminars that I've taught at the Sam Fox School in the past 2 semesters. And the goal of this series of speculations lies in evaluating the potency of this emergent technology to the deeply critical and serious endeavor of envisioning and creating the built environment. With the proliferation of AI systems in design workflows, the designer's role as a critic has become much more eminent than ever before. The newer AI systems possess a sophisticated mechanism of engaging graphic information through a well-tuned web of filters and biases. This mechanism functions contrary to how humans engage the same kind of information. And this crucial difference possesses an incredible potential in the way we conceive and produce the built environment, especially one that is coming up against a myriad of urgencies with regards to the environment, politics, technology, and social equity, to name a very few. A lack of an explicit and integrated solution to these ever-evolving issues exposes the wide gap of the ability of architecture, or at least the way architecture stands today in this self-enclosed vacuum, to carve out an attainable and sustainable future for us all. One aspect that positions AI systems exceptionally well to potentially address these urgencies facing the built environment is their ability to interrogate and parse through a vast repository of data based on a pre-established set of parameters, and without falling prey to the traditional biases that us humans are bound to. These systems are influenced by the human biases, but not entirely constrained to them, instead exposing a complex genre of machine biases. This results in a new class of compositions that are visually potent, but not, or at least not yet, attuned to the critical discourse of architectural production and aesthetic categories. the AI systems proposes new spatial potentials without necessarily being aware of their value in this imagination of an altered reality. This pushes the human designer and critic to move away from their own preconceived notions of how architecture is and ought to be, while also extrapolating and making sense of these new spatial potentials and learning to dismiss the inherent tropes of the AI systems, of which there are quite many. And also working with AI involves this very structural change in how architects think and work. And approaching this change in an incremental manner and trying to capitalize on these new modes of architectural representations like 3D scanning, this series uses the AI systems to start to envision an altered reality where the physicality of architecture as it stands today becomes the mere starting point of unraveling a unique generative system of design ideas. This transforms the found objects devoid of their context or of their existing context into objects in flux, belonging to some form of reality, just not the one that we currently find ourselves in. Architecture is an inherently three-dimensional endeavor, while we eagerly anticipate and await the eventual conception and proliferation of AI systems that generate robust three-dimensional outputs. The goal of this series is then to inject meaning and, by extension, a spatial logic that transcends the AI-generated output from its pixelated origin into its own architectural language, as though it had always been there. This process of 2D to 3D transposition is a unique skill set that architects possess and hone over time. Only this time it operates under an entirely new construct and context of reading and misreading these pixel choreographies, while arguably, which also arguably construct an unarchitectural mode of architectural representation. And contrasting this very robo-apocalyptic representations of AI in the zeitgeist, our line of inquiry suggests an optimistic, if not yet entirely effective way of incorporating these available and often suddenly ubiquitous technologies into the design workflow. At this point, these Machinic Muses establish a critical stage of reflection on how we can mold the emerging and not yet conceived systems of AI. These future systems should align to it and help produce built environments that robustly integrate the entangled complexities and crises that we find ourselves embedded in with each passing day. Until then, these speculations engage our collective imaginations to open possibilities for a future that looks, feels, and performs very differently than what we've ever known or thought possible.
I've got a mic. All right, so now I'm up here as me, not as Constance. I actually wanted to take a little step back. And I think, Krishna, when you started to talk about history, I think it helps frame a little bit where we are now, just because AI is moving so quickly now. So I wanted to step back to the 1960s, Bell Labs. And I would argue that in the 60s, Bell Labs was the place to be. It was kind of the Google Labs of now. And so they were heavily engineering based, but they did a series of these 9 evening events where they invited artists to come and collaborate. It's unclear about exactly what the goals were on that, but I think it was just to see what the collaboration could bring about. And so I think it's really important to kind of think about the kind of shared knowledge that can be transferred back and forth in these sorts of collaborations. Later, that group in 1970, certain members of that group kind of moved on and formed Experiments in Art and Technology, EAT. They made the Pepsi Pavilion for Osaka. And this, I think, was particularly important. It was a highly immersive environment using the kind of most cutting edge technology of the time. And so just kind of thinking about how we can completely kind of rethink our environment. I think for me that helps to bring a little bit of context. There's many other examples that we could discuss. But I think for me that was, it was mostly artists and engineers. I think there was maybe only, like, in the Osaka Pavilion, maybe 1 or 2 architects. But I wanted to now move forward a little bit into AI. And so we know that AI produces text really quickly. Probably, ChatGPT is what it's probably best known for in the wider population. But in also producing text, it also produces hallucinations, kind of seemingly real, but maybe wrong. What's interesting about ChatGPT, though, it turns a writing problem into a reading problem, right? So it produces the text really quickly, but it requires you, as the reader, to be able to decipher. Is that a hallucination? Is it real? So it still requires that expertise of you as the reader. And I think that's a really important aspect of when we think about teaching. That's my question earlier. But then if we take some of those ideas and we start to think about text to image, it turns a image generation problem into a visual reading problem. So we still have to have that expertise, right? To be able to look into those images and figure out where the perspectives are not right, the things that aren't, that don't really make sense. And so I think that becomes an interesting way to kind of reframe this as a tool, right? It's not replacing our expertise. It still requires our expertise. It enhances our abilities. Because AI, as Krishna mentioned, it's kind of like an autofill, a very advanced autofill. And it attempts to find the next word or arrangement of pixels based on the database that it learned from. So it really depends on that database you learned from. In 1997, David Soldier and artists Komar and Melamid did a little crowdsourcing experiment, if anyone knows this one. It was kind of the People's Choice Award where they curated 2 songs. The most wanted song and the most unwanted song. The most wanted song was incredibly predictable, really boring. I mean, you kind of forgot about it because it was exactly what the most people voted for. The most unwanted song is far more interesting, but very annoying. I thought about playing it for you guys, so I kind of re-listened to it. I hadn't listened to it in a while. I listened to it, and I was like, that is just too hard to listen to. So I wasn't going to subject you guys to that, even though it would be funny for a few seconds, but then it's actually pretty annoying. But it was the strange combinations that it was producing of all the most kind of unwanted elements that people were kind of not voting for, but voting against, right? And so I think AI is kind of similar. AI is going to be very predictable and boring if your prompt is uncreative. So it really depends on you as how you're interacting with it, right? How you're curating it and kind of moving through the different iterations. So that kind of brings in the question, well, what is creative? What does it mean to be creative? And how do you promote innovation? I think one way to answer this is through combination. And so you can combine dissimilar ideas or elements or assemblies. You can combine the VCR with the peanut butter sandwich, or then adding King James into that. Or you can have alphabet and houses, right? And so some of these kind of less predictable combinations can be a way to interrogate things you haven't thought of. I think there's certain elements kind of within that keeps it from going too far, but still makes it interesting, right, and usable. So it's issues of uncanny, right? There's got to be enough similarity to the things that we know that it's not just completely otherworldly, that we can relate it, but it's always just a little bit off. I think those become really useful moments. And it also has with what Constance had in her earlier presentation, defamiliarization, right? Taking something that we know and starting to defamiliarize it. It makes you interrogate it in a new way. I think all those are really important opportunities in terms of using this technology to allow you to kind of think outside of your preconceived ideas. And so I want to talk about a few classes that I've done. This is a fabricated drawings class. And it starts with taking kind of two different images and sampling them, running them through an algorithm, and then doing a combination. And so we're using a software called Grasshopper, which is a visual programming language. And the great thing about visual programming is it's accessible to non-programmers. And I think that's one of the reasons why it has become quite useful in the design fields. Right? So you don't have to have the expertise of being a programmer. You can figure out how to incorporate it. Very early on in the process, I just kind of have this looping through some of these drawings, but very early on in the process, we used a convolutional neural networks just to, it was the style transfer. I think, Kory, you had mentioned that, right? Where you take two images, and the one is learning from, the other is the kind of source, and is trying to combine the two. And so it very much had resonance with where I wanted to get to with this class, which is ultimately a lot more control and using Grasshopper to sample images, generate three-dimensional geometry that could then be output to our digital fabrication equipment, 3D printers, robotically controlled cutters, things like that. And so there's the translation issue and precision, which I think is really important, right? How do we kind of take this knowledge and then be able to translate it into something that we could ultimately try to build in the real world? And so that became kind of a foundation, and for me it was kind of a quick exercise, which now I'm definitely kind of rethinking after of just how we integrate it, because it is new and trying to figure out just where do we bring it in, and how can we kind of bring it along to become more useful. Another studio that I want to mention is called The Past Future. And it was just this past semester. And so with this class, it was both a hypothetical class where we're looking to the past, to the 1904 World's Fair here in St. Louis, taking an element from that, projecting it to the future, 2045. And so it's this unknown future. You have to take this element and give it a whole new future other than what actually happened to it. So it's completely inventive, right? It's completely speculative. And then you have to make a factory for that particular element. So even in the production of the syllabus, like, oh, how do I even show a factory that does not even exist? So I went to Midjourney, right? I was like, I started typing in some different opportunities, and just so I could kind of bring that along. And then really early on in the design process, as the students are trying to come up with this whole new narrative, I said, okay, let's go to Midjourney, and let's start to develop some images of that. And you'll see it'll loop back in a second, and we'll see Aaron Luo's. So here's the syllabus images. And then we jump to Aaron Luo's typewriter, and now he's using Midjourney, actually using it as a background at a certain point and adding his elements into it. And then how that then translates into an idea of combination. And for there, it's being translated just into three-dimensional modeling. So we've kind of left the AI behind, but it becomes a background of the ideas of how we can combine. And then we have Angie Long and David E's project. Similarly, starting at the same point of taking a historic object, providing a new future for it. And so I think this is kind of one method. And I think, Kory, it's kind of what you had mentioned about the kind of sketch as a starting point, and that's very much how we used it. But I think it definitely brings up this kind of question of how we use it and how it can be kind of more beneficial. All right. So with that.
Yeah.
Hongxi.
Thanks, Chandler. It's very interesting. So fundamental question is, do you think AI going to be promote creativity or just never give you creative design?
I think if you're creative, right, then you'll know how to use it in a creative way. But for me, I think it's still about what you read into it. It's that reading problem, right? So turning the writing problem into a reading problem. So you can quickly generate images, which is what I'm going to focus more on, being more of a visual person and kind of teaching more in a visual manner. To be able to produce those kind of series of images and kind of iterate through that and producing an analysis along the way and being critical of what you're discovering. But I think the interesting thing of where we are right now is still going from 2D and then translating that into 3D, right? And I think it's definitely in your projects as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think to answer your question, it's objective in the sense like it is what you make out of it, right? And with students, I like to kind of use the analogy of how kind of digital revolution took over architecture, in the sense that at first we were kind of frazzled with how to kind of use these technologies, and everyone was trying to grapple with the cool geometries that were now possible in a history of a profession that has been mostly documenting in 2 dimensions everything that they conceived in 3 dimensions, right? So that kind of revolution, slowly in the past few years, we're trying to be comfortable with this sense that, okay, it's not what it is doing to us, but it is how we use kind of these technologies. And in the same way, it's like instead of, and kind of coming into this full circle moment of the post-digital moment where we're seeing this same trend happening with the advent of AI, it's like, I tell my students, don't do what Rhino or Maya is making you do for your project. Make Rhino or Maya do what you want it to do. In the same way, don't kind of like sit back and be a spectator in this drama that AI seems to be producing every day, but kind of take a little more agency in the fact that there's a lot of things that we discussed AI does amazingly, but a lot of things that only architects and designers who have kind of a sense and direction in this project building and idea building world can do better, right? So it's kind of figuring out where that agency of push and pull happens rather than giving up entire control or kind of keeping the whole control to yourself.
It kind of makes me think, Kory, you were mentioning Form Z, right? Software, kind of 80s, the early aughts. I remember looking around and saying, you could see a rendering and say, oh, I know what software that was, who used that, right? So it's very much about how you're using the tool, right? And if you use it as the limitations of the programmer developed it, then you're not necessarily using it as creatively as you could, right? So I think one thing is, as artists, designers, things that we do, are we misuse technology. I think it's so important, right? There's a way that it was designed, but that doesn't mean that's the way it should necessarily be used. You can do a lot of discovery through kind of misuse. And I think that's, for me, where the idea of combination comes into. Because you're looking for ways to produce something that you hadn't yet thought of. How do you step outside of yourself And technology, I think, can help that, help you do that, and can get past preconceived ideas. And so by combining dissimilar things, and you're not fully sure what's going to happen, it's a bit of an experiment in that sense. But I think that can really produce value and allow you to kind of misuse the technology to discover something new along the way.
Hi, I had a question about the World's Fair project. So I know that was fast, but it sounds like you take an object, and that's a reference point for this iterative process that the machine goes through. I'm curious if you involve the students in like the social life of those objects or the material cultural context of those objects. I mean, World's Fairs are particularly ideological sites for designs. I'm just curious if you could talk about that a little bit. Sure.
Yeah, I think part of the initial process was trying to understand the product. It was inventions, which was part of what was interesting about it, right? So the World's Fairs used to be where knowledge was exchanged. So at our particular World's Fair here, there's 117 miles of exhibits. And so people travel around the world to come here because that's where you get your knowledge. And so there were important discoveries. And so as part of them selecting it, they had to understand why was it important? Why is it provocative? What was it replacing? Because as they're then having to come up with a whole new alternative future for it, you have to understand what happened to it. And so that was definitely the thing you can't do with it. But then try to understand kind of the core of its abilities. And so the context was important. But the projection forward is into a completely new context, right? Which makes you, again, kind of rethink and project on what the society would be in 2045. And I chose 2045 specifically because that was the year that futurist Ray Kurzweil predicted that AI would surpass human intelligence. And so I was just kind of throwing that into the mix. So it kept it on a bit of a sci-fi kind of quality.
I think it's really interesting to break this up into a read versus write problem, and it makes me think a lot of futurists, and just in general, technology changes language. Like, texting obviously introduced a whole new vocabulary, and a lot of future authors produce languages for their scenes and the thing they're trying to create. And I wonder if you've experimented with language. I know Midjourney and DALL-E, all of these can read multiple languages, including computer programming languages. And what sort of predictions you have for how language might affect how you create otherworldly environments or these kind of objects projected into the future?
No, it's definitely an interesting one. I haven't really experimented with other languages. But what's interesting about this is it does make you focus on language. And you realize, I've realized how much I rely on visual language, right? When you see things, and there's qualities that you haven't yet figured out words for, but you just know it, right? And it makes you stop and analyze. Okay, if I was going to try and then put that into words, how would I do that? Traditionally, in my process, words come after the design, right? There's an intuition of working through visual language. So I think that the idea of language kind of gets expanded, and maybe that's one of the ideas of how would you change things, right? In the future, how could we kind of communicate to it in other ways? So it's not just kind of text-based.
And it also kind of comes up where the way you describe something to the AI system is very different than how you would describe your project to your friend, right? It becomes less about general overall ideas and theses and concepts and more about the specific features in a lot of ways, kind of dialing down your aspirations to kind of get these more robust results and kind of working a little bit back and forth between that. So I think that's kind of a thing that we all struggle with, and you mentioned it about like the power of jargons. And one of the things we've discussed in class is the meaning of the word organic kind of changes in a lot of contexts. And for architects, it means something entirely different than for agriculture, and how you can kind of start controlling some of those parameters and in the way they infiltrate into the results that you're getting, right? I think there's a lot of this mystical back-end world that we try to understand, but not always kind of grasp the entire complexity of, but being able to kind of have a little more agency over that back-end and saying, well, I don't mean organic like a fruit, but I do mean it like a type of architectural formal language, should really help in kind of getting more results that are kind of in line with the creativity that we possess rather than some other field does.
Thank you. What really happens with DALL-E and all these other models is your prompt gets mapped into a sequence of points in something like an 8,000 dimensional space. It's a very vast space. You can't even conceive how vast it is. And language can only express a very limited set of points there. And if you want to deviate from that in any interesting direction, language is not terribly useful. I mean, you can throw in some of the words that you came up with to describe your creations. I know they were bizarre, but the reason is it was tugging those points in a certain way that helped. But there's nothing that suggests that language as we know it today is the best way to walk that solution space. In fact, you can provide feedback, you can provide examples from other images. There might be interesting knobs that get created because something studies the layout of content in that space and says, this is a nice dimension on which we want a slider of some sort, right? There's something yet hasn't been invented which goes sort of beyond language. I mean, there's obviously feedback, there's communication, and then maybe knobs, right? And maybe there are more things we don't yet know that are going to allow us to navigate that space. But just the fact that that space is so empty, and there is, sorry, no, I shouldn't say empty. It is so vast, and then every point there represents something useful, and we haven't explored it, makes this very tantalizing.
AI in its essence is very heuristic, which means the solutions given by AI are always work in progress. Where do you see our profession reconciling very deterministic nature of what we do with that ever-changing landscape that AI delivers? And then how can we change that landscape that AI delivers into something that creates the context that we are using for problem solving versus being led by current results from AI?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea because design is always evolving, right? It's a question, when does design end, right? When do you have enough information that you feel like you can make good decisions, right? And so I see AI as a way to make us more informed, right? And technology in general has made the designer more informed, doing simulations to understand performance and behavior, as well as aesthetic decisions. And so on one hand, technology has allowed us to run many more iterations. I'm thinking kind of even prior to AI and the turning of the century, right? Greg Lynn was producing just multiple families of iterations because in a way you could. And then it changed the way you make decisions about that. And of course, because he was using animation software. And so animations were just producing countless frames. And so the more that he had to look at, people would ask him, well, how do you choose one? And it becomes a question of looking for patterns and curating and finding certain qualities, right? And I think we have a lot more variables, right, that we can now introduce in terms of performance and not just aesthetic qualities. I think that becomes a question of how do we filter that much more information to try and come up with what is, in your opinion, kind of the best way to move forward and to kind of finalize things to the point at which it can then move into something that gets built. I'm not sure, to be honest, right? I mean, because more information just means more methods of now deciphering that, analyzing, and taking that to be able to synthesize it. In a way, AI in other fields has largely been used to crunch data, right? To analyze data. And so maybe that's where creative professions, we're getting like inundated with data, right? Potentially, how do we sort and filter? So I think that could be a way, but we need to invent those ways of kind of taking that data and making it useful to us.
So we've come to near the end, but I wanted to ask you one question. I like where you started with talking about Bell and the EAT, so engineering, art, and technology. So this could be fun to just think about I should be thinking about this always as a school, right? But how can we do some of the spirit of what you said, the experimentation without the intention? I mean, sometimes we're so invested in problem solving that we forget those kind of examples. And I think one of our goals here is to bring more of that spirit to things. And I also thought Kavita's an answer, and we were talking about movement, and the performative elements of that were also a big part, which we're not structured that way necessarily, but movement is a big part of those experiments, and dance. So any thoughts about how to bring our campus to life around these experimentations maybe?
Yeah, actually, I was listening to a podcast recently, and it was about AI, but the authors who were brought in were computer scientists, and one of their critiques of creativity was objectives, of having very fixed objectives before you start means that you're going to be limited to go down that certain path, right? And it doesn't allow for kind of seeing things that maybe look like anomalies and to explore those. And so I think it was really more geared towards businesses they were talking, right? But I think having the kind of open-ended experiments, say, okay, here's a starting point, and let's kind of see where that goes, but making it multidisciplinary. I think that does, we throw that term around a lot, but I think it really is interesting, right? And for me, I do go back to the 9 evenings quite a bit, because you see, Rauschenberg in there, like that. Those must have been some really interesting conversations, right? And I think just carving out time and space to say, let's figure out a starting point, and let's just let it evolve. And probably most of them may not go to an interesting place, but finding the tangents along the way I think that could be really useful.
Thank you. Well, let's thank Chandler. Yeah, and we have Jonathan next, Hanahan, who's going to lead his panel on AI and interaction. So Sharvari and Chandler, thanks. That was a very provocative session. I think Constance would be proud. Hopefully she'll show up soon. So we'll take we have actually a 15-minute break, so you have a little more time and then we'll have the final panel, and then we'll conclude too with closing remarks by Dean Bobick in engineering before our reception.
Hello? 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 Roger? Oh. You want me to say more? Okay. Does that sound? I feel like you can't hear me, and I'm having to turn my head.
I can hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, I'm just going to keep talking and testing and testing. I'm going to start singing something really good. I'll sing.
Can you sing?
Let's hope so.
Hopefully I'll start calling her.
Oh, there you are.
What's the McKelvey challenge? Oh, it was, we used a bunch of the McKelvey gifts to enable others.
Okay, ready?
Sure.
Okay. If we could get settled, we're going to start our next panel. As I mentioned, led by Jonathan Hanahan, who is Associate Professor in the Design Program in the College of Art, and also he's the pioneer too, starting our HCI minor with McKelvey in collaboration, our fastest growing undergraduate minor. So I'll let him introduce his panelists.
Sure.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Is my mic on? Can you hear me? I'm going to read something real quick, and then we're going to chat for a little while. So, I'm excited to have my colleagues from HCI, Interaction Design, and the Design for Technologies curriculum here to talk today that really bridge this relationship between the Sam Fox School, the College of Art, and the College of Engineering. And because this moment, I think, is super important, particularly for our research and the work that our students are doing. As Carmon mentioned, in 2019, we launched the Collaborative HCI minor, which is now currently has over 170 students from across WashU. And that relationship of user interface and user experience design is really valuable now because not only we've heard a lot of interesting things about the use of technology or the use of AI creatively today. I'm really interested to discuss the idea of using creativity to design the interfaces with those tools. So the priority of what we are primarily tasked with as interaction designers is designing the interfaces and the tools that others use. And so we're interested in curating the threshold between humans and computers to create delightful, productive, elegant, and safe experiences with technology. So much of the debate over AI over the past few months has focused on the question of what it is, what it can do, and what will it do. My questions to this panel through that lens of UX and UI are focused more on why we would use it, and particularly how we will interact with it. So answering these questions while also understanding the global implications of its use, distribution, adoption are the foundation for our forthcoming Masters of Design for Emerging Technology program, a program that I've been spearheading and I'm really excited about. This room is full of people that have contributed to the development of that program. And it's events like today that about the future of experiences with technology that I believe will plant a flag for our school and the university as leaders in the next era of designing for current and emerging technology. So I was listening to a podcast, as many of us have mentioned that we do sometimes, with a bunch of venture capitalists over the weekend. And they noted that we're only 4 months into this conversation, really. I mean, a year tops. This is brand new. And so, about the conversation about the true integration of AI, not only into our lives as designers, but also as citizens. And so the coming months and years, there's going to be a lot of exploration, a lot of pushing boundaries, and a lot of mistakes. And so for reference, in the development of search, Google was the 20th company to launch a product. In social media, Facebook was the 7th. So while ChatGPT, DALL-E, Midjourney, all of these are kind of our first forays into user interfaces with AI, they will certainly not be the last. And I say this because while there's a great amount of fear and concern and kind of fraught thoughts about what we're going to do, about how this will influence the careers of young UI and UX designers, this moment right now is a ripe opportunity to define how creative industries and the broader world will use these technologies through the design and development of new, novel ways of interacting with them. So this situates user experience and user interaction design at a critical junction between how humans and computers interact. And this panel is really intended to focus on how creativity and interaction interface design can guide us through the next era of digital experiences. So a lot of what I'm going to ask and what we're going to talk about today has come over the past couple weeks in talking with our students. And so we're going to also continue that process here. I have a couple questions I want to ask, but we're also going to put this Slido Q&A thing up. So you can scan, this code will pop up in a second, contribute questions, upvote questions, et cetera. But the idea is to be able to continue to add to that conversation and allow those that don't necessarily want to speak up to contribute as well. So the first question I want to ask, I guess, to the group is, really mainstream media has talked at length recently how AI is coming for creativity, which is an inversion of the order of operations that it was originally thought to take place. It was assumed that creativity would be the last thing to go. So I guess I just want to talk a little bit about that assumption. Why is it this concern in art, design, and engineering impacting these things? And then is that a misplaced assumption? Do you want to talk?
Who do you want to tag?
Anyone, yeah, just go for it.
Well, being polite.
Okay, so I'll start. So I think there's a lot of things that we see as creative. There's a lot of just labor in the work that we classify as being creative work that's not really that creative. So there's a lot of people who are writing, technical documentation, which would qualify in some definitions as being creative work. But really, there's a lot of underlying patterns to it, a lot of underlying structure. There's not a lot of really core creativity in that kind of stuff. And I think those kinds of things, I think we're defining the term creativity too loosely to be, anything where there's not a formula that we can kind of plug in and say, here's the answer. But there's a big range there, right? There are things that are truly, things that we haven't seen before, things that are sort of remixing human ideas in new ways and adding to sort of the space of what we've done as a creative practice and as a human species and whatever, and things that are just making more of the same. And as we lump all of those together, I think the more of the sames are going to be the ones to go, right? And the things where, we're talking about remixing into new spaces are things where there's really an opportunity to sort of draw on disciplines that are further afield, to sort of make connections between other stuff that's out there that hasn't been recombined.
I mean, I'll add to that. And one definition of creativity is just creating something that you haven't seen, right? And there are some opportunities here for us to use AI to create new things. But random isn't necessarily like akin to the spontaneity that that artists would have. And so I don't believe that AI is going to be replacing creativity, but it's going to allow us to create different things. Now, I kind of worry about the cyclical effect of that, and that's a conversation for another day, but I do think that there are lots of opportunities here for us to think about human plus AI and think about things that we could never imagine, the rapid prototyping, things that we couldn't have done before.
I'm ready. Is it on? No? Okay. Can anybody hear me? Okay. So it's sort of interesting to think about, are they coming for us? Because who are they, right? And there's a lot of thoughts about that. I don't like to think of having barriers between the disciplines we play in, right? And so when students will say, tell me how to use AI or how do I integrate AI, it's not really about how, but to have a curious mindset. And so someone talked about tech misuse. Yes. We're already engaged with AI and have been for quite some time in all the tools that we use every day. And so I think we have to be really careful about technological gatekeeping, and for everyone and anyone to feel like they can create with these tools, they can misuse these tools, they can innovate, they can think about the ethics fearlessly, not be afraid to ask questions. I was talking to you over the weekend about when .com started, they were trying to integrate designers and engineers together so we could work happily. And they said, okay, you can ask anything. And I was like, okay, I want to know how the internet gets through the wires. And the engineers laughed so hard. But that's really important, and that's how I think students or anyone can continue to play, whether you're asking about art or you're asking about tech or design, and to come from a space of imagination rather than what's the technology handing to me. And I think a lot of people have kind of already said that today. Right?
Yeah, like I was, this kind of goes into the next question, but I saw a quote from David Freeberg, who's an entrepreneur, and he talked about how, and Aaron mentioned this earlier too, this happens all the time where with each new thing, it sort of initially disrupts the role that we play, right? From painting to photography, from photography to digital photography, from animation to CGI, that it sort of initiates this, this disruption, but also this opportunity for new forms of artistic practice. And so until we know what those things might be, there's a little bit of sort of panic. So I just wanted to kind of propose or ask how we think this is going to change the process of design, not in general, but also the process of designers who are designing for technology and designing experiences with technology. Ask it again. How is this going to change the creative process for all designers, but particularly designers for technology?
I can think of negative and positive effects. So some of the positive effects, when we, as a designer, you talk to stakeholders, and oftentimes people will say something, try to explain what they want, but people are very bad at explaining that. And so I can see this tool being very effective at just rapid prototyping and like giving people the ability to fine-tune these ideas. So I can see that as a positive effect. I worry though about the biases that are introduced by these AI algorithms. And so are we all gonna be designing the same stuff over and over again? And especially as these algorithms get updated with the new data sets that are gonna be produced by the algorithms, then do we all just converge into just similar things being reproduced all the time? And so I can see both positive and negative effects.
Yeah, I read a thing the other day about that process of, and I think that's actually been disproved well today for a lot of the things that we've heard, this assumption that I'm going to ask it a question, it's going to spit out a thing, and then that's going to be the result. And actually the process being about that dialogue, which is can be a long-term thing, right? That maybe it's a good way to start to move from a blank page to something, but also the idea of doing research through AI, asking it questions and finding out stuff, starting to generate the content, taking it out, giving it to humans, making some changes, editing, then giving it back to the thing. And so it becomes another collaborative entity as opposed to just a tool, an output device. And I think curating that relationship and encouraging those types of relationships can be really exciting and a huge opportunity. And it also, the way that efficiency plays into that too. So the idea of something that may have taken weeks in the past, getting through those steps very quickly, particularly in the tech space. So.
I mean, the current version that we have right now, I don't see that as accelerating the process at all. For any of you who've been playing around with it, it takes me a lot longer to do things. And a lot of it is a little bit exciting, but there is a learning curve. And as Kory talked about, I wonder if there might be some process of us trying to learn its language. It seems like it's created a language of its own, and so maybe we need to learn, what do you say, Texas Revolution or dog vials, or do we need to figure out this language? But then there are challenges for us to think about how to incorporate more of the HCI researchers, because the interface that we use right now, text, it limits what we can do. But there could be other interfaces. And so it needs a lot of work, a lot of collaborations with HCI folks to figure out what are the best interfaces for these AI algorithms.
Thinking to what Kory was saying earlier, my experience with these have been, it's like a relationship with a particular model, and you have to talk to it to know how, and start to kind of understand how it might respond to you and encourage particular things. So that's where with each shift in the model or each new model or each change, having a greater transparency of what is inside of that and unlocking that black box, I think becomes really key to create trustworthy experiences with the things that are being spit out.
I think one of the other things that it does is really center examples as sort of a core mechanic. And in some ways, that's great for humans. Like, a lot of human learning is really tied into examples. Like, we use examples as ways of communicating, here's a process that you can go through, here's the kind of thing that you want to produce. But I think one of the key differences is that, here, the kinds of examples that a human would produce and the kinds of examples that a system would produce may be very different, right? And so you kind of want examples as a way to search and navigate through a space. But where we would create an example that's close to what we want, the system won't know how to do that necessarily, right? And so, can we learn to navigate in a space where, a space of crazy examples and see the potential in some out there example, or, and to allow that to sort of evolve the process of how we interact with things. And I think there's also sort of issues of overload, right? So, you go to a restaurant that has, 50 billion items on its menu, and you're like, okay, I just need my choice of 3 here, and then I'm good. And so you've got this, huge empty space with an infinite number of possibilities. Like, how do you select the right things that are sort of close enough but far enough that you can, use that as a way to help people make decisions about where they want to go in that space.
Mm-hmm. That sort of leads to my next question about this idea of prediction, because Alvitta was asking me a question at one of the breaks about I've used Runway a lot because it allows you to train your own models and input your own items. And a part of the reason that process is really interesting to me, because as a designer, I want to give away as much control as I possibly can. Like, I don't want to make any arbitrary decisions. So giving it all the inputs that I want, and then allowing it to give me.
But then if it makes arbitrary decisions, aren't you just?
But they're not my arbitrary decisions.
So they're still arbitrary decisions.
Maybe, right? So that question leads to this, the word predictability or prediction has come up quite a bit. And we have many interfaces that we're already using that are attempting to do that, right? Where Siri attempts to figure out what you're going to do next, or based off of what apps you've used in the past, or what's on your calendar, where you might be driving once you get in the car. And so I'm curious kind of what thoughts maybe you have about an evolution away from the traditional call and response interfaces that we use, where we ask Google a question and it gives us a result, and we ask another question. And how does prediction in a large data set potentially change the way we interact with tools and technology?
I'm thinking a lot about predictability because it's beautiful in the way it adds safety to a world that's chaotic. But when I think about things like predictive texting, you also have to think about unintended implications, like the ways it homogenizes language, right? Because we're taking the messiness out of life. Like, there's a beauty to a spelling error. There's a beauty to me having to craft a message back with a typo than just saying, okay, see you later. And so, none of that is right or wrong. It's just sort of like unpacking unintended consequences, right? And so there's many in AI, there's many in prediction, for better and for worse. And so I guess it's sort of like thinking about the balance between innovation, implications, ethics. I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
I guess it depends on how you think about prediction. So that is thinking about prediction as a big data problem. So giving you an option based on what most people do. There are small data approaches to prediction. And so I think about this a lot, specifically in the context of data exploration for visualization. That's my research area. And so we do a lot of prediction based on what are the things that I've seen you done in the past, and then make personalized predictions for what you might want to explore in the future. Right. And so I think there are opportunities here for predictions from a small data perspective, at least until when we've solved that issue with the big data approaches. I do think that prediction is possible in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic that, I mean, my take is that we've reached the point, we've reached the tipping point of screens. Like, we cannot continue to layer more and more screens into this space. So thinking of more ambient ways that we interact with technology that can use a lot of that data in interesting ways are super exciting to think about how layering mixtures of not only what I have asked in the past or what I might ask, but also the context of where I am, like my heart rate, what I'm doing next, who's around me, all of these sort of things become opportunities that I would hope that technology becomes less imposing and more subconscious and more ambient in that way. That's very optimistic, but.
Yeah, and I think you then sort of get into this, like, what is good situation, right? Where, you know, and so like that comes in sort of like trivial things like text generation. Like if we, you know, decide that good is written in this style, then we're going to sort of push everyone towards that. Mm-hmm. But now you've got, you know, body sensors and you're like making out things, and maybe it, you know, decides that it's good for us all to be calm individuals, and so it's going to, you know, start, you know, playing you soothing music or whatever when you start to get upset because it's detected that that's the case, right? Mm-hmm. But like, what if you really need to get mad in order to have your next great idea?
Yeah.
So what's good? You know, so like, is it good to, what's the right goal, and how does it,
yeah.
how does that get selected?
Oh.
Is that how you come up with your ideas?
Getting mad, yeah. Sometimes.
So I want to get to some of these questions, but the last thing I wanted to end on is, because I feel like we're obligated from an ethics perspective to ask this question too, is, you know, Carolyn Sinders, who's a machine learning researcher, she's had a big a role in the development of our new graduate program. She's also going to be here in a couple weeks to do a lecture and workshop, just to throw that out there if people are interested. But she coined this idea of evolving human-centered design to human rights-centered design, and focusing the design process less on the opportunities a new technology presents, but what could go wrong, designing from the perspective of what could go wrong and building backwards. And so I think it's important that we ask, like, what could go wrong, right? How do we make sure that that's forefronted in the future development of each new interface with artificial intelligence?
Can I talk about this for a second?
Yeah, you're perfect.
So I don't know if some of my students are in here, but you know, there's new, like, simple ways things are being integrated. Like, instead of doing personas when you're building a tech product, there's this new thing where you do anti-personas. So you think of the person with the unintended consequences, right? So that's like low-hanging fruit, kind of easy to do. But then, I mean, that's the beauty of learning at an institution like this, because you have true interdisciplinary potential. So you can have a philosopher and a technologist and a designer all at the table in a project which addresses exactly what she's talking about, right? And so I know we're on the same page about that. And so, I mean, really, that would be, that's why it's an amazing place for this to happen, I think. Anyway.
I think one of the big risks is that, you know, this is all basically fancy statistics, right? Which thing comes before what thing comes before what thing, right? And so we've already seen situations where, you know, people have like, hey, generate me a related work section for my paper, which cites papers that don't exist and results that don't exist, right? And so somebody else has alluded to this in the notion of like, well, somebody else is doing the writing, but now you really have to take responsibility for knowing whether or not that's correct, right? But there's a lot of evidence that that humans are lazy in that sort of setting, right? And we're not going to be careful about 100% of the things that we do. And so then, what is to stop somebody who's, on a deadline to turn in their paper or to, get their thing out or to write code or whatever, from taking the shortcut of not really knowing whether or not this is accurate and does what it says that it's going to do all the time, or whether there's some, right? I mean, we're sort of building something that relies on human attention, which is pretty scarce and not very disciplined in a lot of cases, to sort of be the thing that polices accuracy and looks out for the sort of
But that
the
in
darker
and of
side.
itself, though, is something that we need to grapple with as a society, because what is true? About 2 years ago or so, if someone said that the pandemic was caused by a lab leak or something like that, people were getting taken off of social media because of that. But that is now a possibility. That is now a theory that people are accepting to be a possibility. And so what we think of as true evolves over time, and who gets to police that is something that we need to talk about. And I don't know what the right answer is. Other things that I think about that could go wrong is the unknown. So I don't know what ChatGPT is doing. The people who created it don't really know what it's doing, and there are questions about, is it AGI? Do you see some glimmers of AGI or not? But I think, generally speaking, OpenAI was both brilliant and reckless for releasing this. Brilliant in the sense that they have millions of people testing it for them and refining their models for them. That is something that would have taken a very long time if they didn't expose it to the world. But I don't know what it's going to evolve into. We don't know. And so I'm both excited and anxious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where the importance and necessity and consideration that goes into what that interface of experience for everybody is, both designers, but also just how society communicates and interacts with this thing is an incredibly important threshold, because the establishment of that trustworthiness is vital for any sort of future integration, right? The moments, and those cracks are going to come for sure. Things are going to break. People are going to push things too far. But how that's clarified, how that's addressed and communicated, so that we can make productive moves forward is going to be key, and is on the shoulders of those that are, I think, designing at that intersection. Do you want to do some of these?
Yeah.
Good.
Which one? You want to pick one?
Go in order.
I like the human mistake one. I want to know who sent that. I mean, I know I said it. But I was trying to think about how, you remember when the internet got really smooth and perfect? It wasn't .com pixeled anymore. And then Etsy came about and everyone longed for craft again. So I just can see, I can imagine the ways in which we're going to see this, and it's going to be so perfect that we'll long for messiness in human relationships, in communication. And I don't know, that's a philosophical standpoint, but everything ultimately comes back to some kind of philosophy. So I don't know what yet, but I mean, I don't know. I find myself using it to send things, and then I think I should just stay being messy, communicating Heather, So anyway.
Is it the Amish that wouldn't make anything that was perfect? That there always had to be a mistake in it because that made it inherently human?
Yeah, I mean, Chandler mentioned that too, is that part of the beauty of creative practice is misusing tools and challenging their intent and sort of intentionally breaking them in ways that can produce more productive results. And so I think that this is a moment that really we're all doing that, right? We're sort of trying to push it to a breaking point to find its faults so that it evolves and creates things that we're not really expecting.
And I think one of the key words there is productive, right? Because like you're defining productive in a different way than, say, a marketing person who wanted to produce more glossy things that they could pass out to people, right? And to the degree that those end up getting baked in, I mean, that seems like, Kory, when you were talking about the different versions of, I forget the name of the system, but like there's sort of a, there was sort of more, more creative intent possible in spaces where it hadn't been tuned to somebody's particular model of productivity.
Yeah, like the small, that abstraction is capable, and once that data set continues to grow, it starts to get too good for the unexpected result. And so valuing productivity between expression and abstraction and
allowing multiple definitions of productive, right?
Right.
Your productive may not be my productive. And that's, I think, a value that should be built in.
Yeah. Oh.
Should we go with the top one? Can you read it out, Jonathan?
Yeah. What?
Read it out.
Yeah, let's do that. How does the emergence of new technologies affect the definition of people's roles? Will there ever be a need for pure designers who don't adapt to these changes? What's a pure designer?
Right? I don't know what a pure designer is. I kind of like to use analogies, right? Like this can go lots of different ways. This can be, and I think this is Aaron's idea is correct. This could be like the camera where we have a lot of bad images hanging around. But in some cases, it could be like the calculator. And so mathematicians didn't need to do long divisions anymore, and that didn't really take away the need for mathematicians, but it just means that now they're able to do bigger things more quickly. And so I think it's going to be a combination of the two. I don't know what it means to be a pure designer, but
or maybe it just results in the movement away to alternative outputs, right? In the same way that like when painting was no longer about recreating reality, it can become another thing. And so how does graphic design, how does copywriting, how do these things that are more, have a specific focus that their role isn't that thing anymore, can actually become something more. There's freedom in that as opposed to loss. And so that's, I think, back to a lot of the, we don't know what that next space is going to be. And so there's fear in like, I'm losing my job, but history has shown that is not the case. That is never the case. That a new technology comes in and doesn't eliminate, it just augments and it shifts those pathways.
How can we make the process more transparent, open, and easy to use? Ooh, I think we're going to have to think about. So the problem with the question, for those of us who can't see, curating training models seem to be a huge part of getting good output from AIs. How do we make that process more transparent, open, and easy to use? Why I'm struggling to answer that question is because the people who are creating the AI models right now is driven by for-profit companies. And so there is a profit motive there. There are some open source options that are available now. I don't know if they would ever be as good as the for-profit options, but I think we need open source alternatives. We cannot at all, we can't dictate what these for-profit companies do. I don't know what that means for maybe the role of universities for creating and maintaining some of these models, but we need to think about how do we separate the models that we work with as an academic institute versus the models that are created by for-profit industries.
I think there's also a space in Krishna talked about the notion of knobs, right? And sort of identifying places in the space where, a little bit of movement makes some interesting thing, right? And so looking at, and you can kind of envision ways of doing that based on the structure of how neural nets work, of being able to just tweak, what is the value from this thing, and can we, take what I have now and sort of shift it this way. And you could also imagine, the system exploring some of that and figuring out where the interesting ones were, and then sort of making that something that you could play with. So instead of getting, here's my set of 5 images, which one do you like the best, or which one do you want to reproduce around? You would get, here's a set of controls that seem to generate deviation in some way that's interesting. And you could imagine doing that at sort of coarse and fine grains, where you say, like, I want stuff that's really different from this, so I want my knobs to like go in crazy directions. And like this is close, but it's not quite there, right? So now I want a finer control of within a local part of the space as opposed to a broader.
When we were talking a couple days ago about how is Photoshop going to change when these plugins start to come into play, and the interest about maybe that's like automating certain things, but also I think you can describe it better. You mentioned the idea of that feedback of saying, this is how I got to this point. These are the things that I did. Like, these are the processes that I did to your image to get it to this point. And I think that becomes a really interesting.
Yeah, I don't think that that's the same thing as transparency in this context, right? So there's sort of 2 different things that are fighting with each other. One is like, I have this artifact, and I'm interested in, given the sort of operation space of a particular tool, what do I do in order to make this artifact? And that's interesting. It's also interesting from, Aaron's comment about making bad photographs, right? Like, that's the kind of analysis you do to say, like, hey, if you could figure out better lighting or better, I'm not a photographer, so I'm probably the contributor to those bad photographs, but that's sort of one piece, right? And then there's another piece that is actually the history of how something was created, which I think is also an interesting thing, but it's not it's not data that we're capturing about a lot of things right now. And so, in the sense that, like, we talked about some of the models being trained on sort of, fuzzing versions of them, right? So we take one and we make it blurrier, and then we try to train it back to its original state, right, as a way of going. You could also imagine doing a similar thing with the history of how an artifact was created. So, first I, lay down something that looked like this, and then I added this, and I added this, and I added that. And that's another structure that could be predictable in this way and then sort of give a different branching. But it's not data that we typically capture. Like, when you make a document, it doesn't have the full history of every edit that has been made. When you write a program, you don't have the whole history of where exactly that came from and what were the pieces that were built first at sort of a fine enough grain. So I think there's an interesting space there, but it's like, it would require us changing what we're storing too.
Want to address that, Caitlin? Where is HCI as a field? The interface question for AI. They feel huge steps backwards for user interaction. Absolutely. But I mean, that's where we always start, right? Number one, these things are very new. And so HCI, they're catching up. If you look at the conferences right now, it's all about ChatGPT. It's all about exploring how humans interact with these things, how to improve them. And so I feel like in the next couple of years, we'll be inundated with a lot of these ChatGPT research questions, which is a little bit annoying for me.
Well, that's kind of why I brought up the list of which interface in each one of these like revolutions, which interface actually sort of took hold and became the thing. Yeah. And it's not the first one, yeah. Right? These are the first ones that we're interacting with. We're using them because it's our, this explosion has happened because we could use them without knowing the guts behind it, without writing the code or understanding the algorithms, which becomes interesting. But there's going to be a whole bunch of little ones, and there's going to be a whole bunch of big players. Apple hasn't even come into this game yet. For someone who cares deeply about the details of experiences with technology. And so how those things shake out over the next months and years is going to be super interesting. And why I think it's super valuable to this school and for our students is that they're going to leave here in the time that they'll be a part of that conversation about designing what that interface is going to be. And I think that's really, really exciting. That's really powerful. When I was a little young architect in undergrad, I remember Galia Solomonov said, "You'll never have as much power as you do right now as a student." And I've been thinking about that a lot in preparing for today, about how this is going to be, our students are going to have a big say in how we interact with these things moving forward. And that's really exciting.
I think one of the other things is that, there aren't very many interfaces that really center examples in sort of as a core mechanic, right? And so as a way of interacting, it's not one that HCI has explored a lot. And I think it's, just come out, and so there's a lot of room to.
Yeah, there are going to be lots of interfaces. So the other question, if and when AI becomes advanced enough to self-correct its inputs based on existing principles and guidelines, what will the role of humans be? My initial snarky response to that is, that's good, because that means that Kenyans won't be sifting through what's bad and what's good. I don't know if, for those of us who don't know, was it New York Times? I don't remember which one of their publications did it, but there was a piece, and the way ChatGPT right now try to filters out what is bad, what is offensive, and what's good. They have a bunch of people in Kenya right now who are sifting through that. And so we're right now exposing people to these bad images, and you can think about the worst things that are on the internet right now. And so that means, hopefully, that we don't need that. But anyone has any non-cynical response to that?
I mean, I think the other thing, it sort of comes back to that notion of what is productive, right? And so there's sort of a human version of what is taste, like what is good here, what should I be trying to produce? And I mean, I think these tools are likely to be more powerful if we don't try to sort of embed one version of taste into them, but allow for, the diversity of kinds of things and kinds of visions that we all have, to be able to sort of create different things.
I mean, if we think about how, like, right now there's one app. We're going to move into it where you can go and do all of these things, right? But as we start to kind of like parse through, and different intents, different needs, different experiences are built on the back, like where we're having individualized spaces, that question is defined by the interface itself, not the general space, right? So if I'm using this particular direction, it's because I'm defining productivity and what I need and what I want to do in this particular way. And then I can step over here, and that's, I think, where the fine-tuning of those models gets really interesting, in that it's not one big bucket.
Yeah, and I feel like they're going to have multiple models, right? I recently started using Google Bard about a week ago, when I had access to it, and I can already see, like, I go to Google when I want specific things, and ChatGPT, is a tiny bit more creative in what it produces. And so I could imagine, like, going to these specialized systems for whatever you need it for. And I'm hoping to see a lot more of these.
Any more? We got a minute or two?
I just keep looking at the question to slow down. And I mean, I guess with everything, it feels important to remember that we have a choice in how we want to spend our time and what we want to make, and that it's a very powerful tool, but it's still just a tool, and that's where the power of the arts is, right? And so, You go to art school in the 90s, you learn to use tools in new ways. You draw with your feet, you draw with a stick, right? You constantly learn to rethink the way you make. And so I don't ever worry. I mean, I worry about the tool and bias and unintended consequences, but I don't fear for my job. I mean, change is inevitable to some degree. So I don't know. I try to remember that I have a choice and that we have the power to rethink the world anew or rethink what we want to imagine or how we want to live, at least to some degree. So, that's where the arts just feel so powerful to me.
Yeah,
imagination.
But, AI is a part of computer science. Computer science as a field is just fast-paced. I don't see us slowing down anytime soon. I agree that there is a choice, but I'm really excited about what we're going to see in the next couple of years. And I don't think the answer is to be afraid of that. The answer is to embrace that and have these difficult discussions that we should be having as a society.
Agreed. Yep.
I think that's a great place.
Great. Thanks. It moved in front of your face right as we were.
I'm timing it's 4 o'clock. Thanks, Alvitta and Caitlin and Heather and Jonathan. Now we gave our Dean of Engineering gets the last word. I think he'll have great insights to share. He's also between us and the final reception. I also want to point out that Constance Vale is here in the audience. So let's hear it for Constance. She made it. And a lot of the symposium has been about your presence, Constance. So over to Dean Bobick. Thanks again for the panel.
Thank you for Carmon for putting me between people and alcohol. I'll try. They gave me 15 minutes, but I'm definitely not going to take that. Those of you who know me know that I don't usually like to use notes, but so much was said today, and I wanted to think a little bit and reflect a little bit on this. The first thing I'll start with, which wasn't really discussed, maybe only briefly, is right now, those of you who don't, my background is actually in AI and computer vision. I got out of it just when machine learning came on because I didn't want to make any money. But we've been, so I and my colleagues, we've been talking a lot about this lately. And the first question that everybody's talking about is, do these large language models, which are what drives ChatGPT and other, are they getting us any closer to what's now referred to as artificial general intelligence? That's a very deep set of questions, and what I was thrilled about is we don't have to talk about that today. Okay, that's really not the question here. The question here is that there's a set of things that we want to think about. So I'll go through just a little bit some things that I pulled out. I do want to, my PhD is actually in brain and cog sci. So I do want to say that even though current systems have 1 trillion connections, human brain about 100 trillion connections, there are very deep reasons to believe that the way humans do things and the way these systems do things may be quite unrelated. Just take a look at the wattage. And that's a big deal, right? You take a look at the energy that's used to do something. The other thing is we have 100 trillion connections in our entire brain. We use very small amounts of our brain for various kinds of tasks. So I don't want people to get distracted by the idea that these are neural networks. I mean, they were called neural networks. Just think of these things as incredible mappers. They map from inputs onto a variety of interesting sets of outputs. And in fact, somebody talked about probing the system, and you were trying to figure out what the word was that you were probing. What you were probing was the mapping. How does it map from the words or symbols into various types of not just images, but categories that connect? Two other things that Krishna mentioned that I want to point out, and then you said other things that I'll get to at the end. There was this interesting thing where you talked about taking multiple stages, where essentially you're using a statistical model to produce an intermediate level of structure, and then from that structure you could go to the next thing. And the way I wrote it down was that code typically implements semantics, right? In order for a computer program to run, there's sort of some well-behaved, not just syntax, but sort of a well-behaved semantics. And so the language of what you might call useful programs is by design restricted to a very small set of things that you might do. And what's interesting is language models are not restricted like that. it's kind of cool, and there's an interesting article out by Stephen Wolfram that I suggest you read about what these large language models may tell us about language, that maybe it's not quite as open-ended, multidimensional as we thought, because these statistical things generate good language. But I think more interestingly is in the space of design, where frankly in design you can get to constraint later, large language models and other kinds of statistical models that will go places essentially in that high dimensional space that you were talking about, for which you don't actually have a concise description, that's actually okay. You can sort of pull that back later. A little bit analogous is you've rendered me some images of something that's kind of like a building. Now what's the closest reasonable building that would kind of look like that? Right? So I think that's important. And then one thing that was essentially, I wrote down when Krishna was saying, as the Dean of Engineering, I will say hallucination in engineering is not typically a good idea. But there is this interesting tension between creative solutions and coming back to the allowed design space, right? And so there's this challenge in engineering of all forms to explore a design space of what we sometimes refer to as feasible designs. So this notion of feasibility in design becomes important. Then for me and Kory, so I wrote in capital letter, craft practice. I mean, hearing you talk about the stages that you went through, the thousands of iterations, the idea that you essentially upweight and downweight these kind of things, you're helping it take this path along this journey, which is exactly the kind of thing you want for something that can generate a lot of stuff, some of which is great and some of which is not, which actually gets to the comment you made of that ChatGPT turns, and this one I'm going to steal for sure, turns a writing problem into a reading problem. I'm going to think deeply about that with respect to all of these AI things, and I will use that quote without attribution, so deal with it. Which actually brings me to, because you were talking about plagiarism versus inspiration, and there's that, actually it's an artist quote, right, that Picasso used to say that good artists borrow, great artists steal. AI makes it really easy to just build on the work of everybody else, and you have no idea where that's coming from. And anybody who gets bent out of shape about that, I'm sorry. That's just done. There's just no way to be able to track that anymore. Something else that you said, which I think we've heard over and over again, was, best designers make the best designs. And I think for this school in particular, also for an engineering, but regardless of the context we find ourselves in, our goal is to be able to produce the people that can do the best. And that means that you will leverage the tools, the capabilities, the procedures, the possibilities to the best. And this is actually going to come back later when we talk about the question that was asked up front about how do we change our curriculum? How do we think about changing our teaching? Well, if we want to create those best designers, they're going to have to be able to leverage that. Already talked about the ChatGPT writing, et cetera. But I'll explore that a little bit more, that two things. One is maybe now creation becomes a little less generative and a little more refining, right? That was always true in a variety of disciplines, where there would be ask any author who's ever written, well, how many books have you written? 10. I thought it was 11. Okay, 11, all right. I'm going to guess the first draft doesn't look a lot like the final draft, right? Writing a book has always been an extraordinarily iterative process. And I think one of the things that generative AI is going to do is make so many more things an iterative process, whereas before it used to be much more. And this actually relates to the comment that was made at the very end. I love this one. There was a time when a lot of painting was about image capture, right? And that went away. But the question of what painting became is now this interesting thing. And what's interesting is digital painting turned painting from a purely generative, because it was a real bear to go back, to a much more iterative process. And I think we can now do that across many disciplines. Something else you said, which I want to vehemently disagree with. you said, well, you have these tools, and the great thing about visual programming is you don't actually have to be a programmer to be able to leverage them. Shame on you. I think at a university as robust as this one, a university where all the students coming in have just an unbelievable intellect, understanding what the nature of programming is a fundamental skill. Doesn't mean you have to know how to do C coding. Maybe you should know Python. But you should be able to think from an algorithmic perspective of how to make those kinds of things happen. And then you actually are way more powerful at the tools. So I think one of the things we might think about embracing is, and especially, I'm standing here as a computer scientist, and we've talked about the connection to engineering, making sure that we make all the creatives as computationally as informed as we can be. I mean, they don't have to be able to write compilers, but they should understand the notion of algorithmic development, because that will make them a lot more powerful with the tools. One last thing, in this, if you were talking about, Krishna was talking about this high-dimensional space, 8,000. Well, that's actually, okay, so in a 1,000 by 1,000 image, right? So that's 1 million pixels. Well, the number of possible images is roughly 255 to the million, okay? It's because it's every pixel will be right. Most of those are just meaningless stuff. I mean, they would look like noise to you. There's a much smaller set of collection of pixels that are even plausibly interpretable as meaning anything. Not meaning, sorry, interpretable as being something. Then there's an even smaller set that is describable by language. One of the interesting things about design, and one of the things we need to prevent, is that letting the limit of what language can describe being the limit of the space that we explore. And so this notion of where is that space beyond the nature of language, I think will be really important. All right. Last panel. So wherever he went. Where did our lead guy go? Jonathan, there he is, thank you. So yes, Google was the whatever search engine, Facebook, et cetera. Google used to worry about that they could get displaced by a company in a garage. There are only 3 companies that can make semiconductors in the world: TSMC, Intel, and Samsung. Why? The last TSMC plant, I don't know if it's the last one, the one that was built in 2021, it cost $19 billion to build that plant, and you had to have a slew of essentially silicon engineers. OpenAI has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on their database, on their essentially the learning machine. Google doesn't disclose it, but we know it's there, Facebook, et cetera. Yes, Apple will get into it. They will spend. The number of models that will get created, in fact, Sam Altman, when he was here, he said the world will have somewhere between 3 and 10 models in it, if you think of these as large-scale models. So the question of this notion of how much variability and open sourceness there will be, I think that's a fundamental question, but we shouldn't kid ourselves how hard it is to make these models. Universities cannot get in this game unless a whole bunch of us were to come together and figure out, how we wanted to do that. Something that Alvitta mentioned, and it flew by real quickly. We talked about rapid prototyping. We were actually talking about this a little bit at lunch today. If something that used to take 3 weeks now takes 3 hours, the notion of what the design process is now going to be very different. You're going to change your set of expectations and requirements, right? Because basically, I don't know about the rest of you, there's a certain amount of time equals money that you will put into a project, and what you'll get out will be a function of what you'll be willing to allocate. If we've now changed by an order of magnitude or 2, the speed at which you can do a bunch of things, that rapid prototyping is going to change that design process in terms of what is acceptable. And I think this notion of what is acceptable is going to go through the roof. There's going to be a lot of stuff that used to be acceptable that no longer will be. And the last thing for that, 2 things. Caitlin said, I loved it, maybe you have to get angry to get your next great idea. I spent a bunch of time at the MIT Media Lab, and one of the things Marvin Minsky was playing with was, what is the role of emotion in human intelligence? And there may be some deep reasons why emotion is fundamental to your ability to explore certain cognitive spaces. We don't actually have any idea at the moment about that, and large language models are not going to help us understand that. But in case you were worried that we're like run out of things to do in AI, we haven't. That will be interesting. And the idea of the role of emotion in design, totally an open question. And the last thing from that panel, you mentioned art. As somebody who's an outsider in this, there is a relation between art and design and a huge difference between art and design. And I think if we were having a panel on AI and art, we would have a whole different set of goals and constraints in mind than if we're thinking about AI and design. It might be another panel to have, and I would put this guy in charge. But I think that's one of the questions. So finally to wrap up, a couple of lines. First one, early on, Krishna said, every month we see a new innovation. And that is right. By the way, you've all seen this call from Elon Musk and others to slow things down. That is just not going to happen. I think somebody said that Elon Musk wants everybody to stop for 6 months so he can catch up. That may be the case. I think you're going to continue to see evolution. I actually think OpenAI did the socially responsible thing by letting it out now, because we are now asking a lot of hard questions that we didn't ask until it was made available, and I think that's going to be really great. Then, with respect to what we're doing here, I'm pretty sure it was Alan Kay who said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And I think you referenced something analogous to that, right? And I think that's right, and I think we can choose to be part of that invention. And that actually leads me to a line that's, it's actually from Thomas Paine, I looked it up, but it's mostly associated with George Patton, and then later Lee Iacocca, which was lead, follow, or get out of the way. And what that actually meant was only the leader or the follower is useful. The get out of the way was that you were sort of on the sidelines. And what did he mean by the following? The follower was that it takes insight to understand how to provide strength behind those that are leading. And I think one of the things for us to figure out is, where do we want to lead, and where do we want to make sure we follow? Because we sure as heck don't want to get out of the way. So with that, please join me in thanking again Krishna and Kavita for triggering this conversation, and it's the first of many. Thank all of you for attending, and I don't know about you, but I think it was a pretty cool afternoon.
Thank you, Aaron. That was perfectly provocative to end on. And now, please join us for a reception right down the commons area, down the steps. Once again, I'd like to thank Krishna and Kavita for their generous gift to Washington University to create this professorship and to create this dialogue. And we are leading your great vision. So thank you for joining us today, and thank everyone for being with us.